The trouble always announced itself in a scent before the city understood its meaning, a faint, sickly sweet note drifting above the gaslit streets of Gilded Age, New York. It curled between the iron rails of elevated trains, seeped through tenement stairwells, and clung to the velvet sleeves of society women, stepping from their carriages. Doctors called it ordinary miasma, the harmless breath of a crowded metropolis. But those who lived closest to the gutters felt something colder coiled within it, something watching. By the time the lamps were lit along Broadway, another name had begun to rise behind closed doors. The plague had returned. At first, the city pretended not to notice. Policemen walked their beats, newsboys shouted headlines of railroad strikes and Tammany scandals, and the wealthy hurried into their parlors, where crystal decanters trembled ever so slightly, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. But down in the warrens of Mulberry Bend, where rooms were too small and windows never opened, the illness spread like a whispered rumor. A cough here, a shiver there. A child collapsing in the street while strangers stepped back, afraid to touch. The newspapers printed reassurances, yet their presses ran with unease. And then came the nights when the danger grew unmistakable. Wagons rolling after midnight, carrying bodies under tarpaulins, hospital wards overflowing with the pale and gasping, physicians working by lamplight with trembling hands, ether bottles uncorked, insisting they still had control. New York had dressed itself in gold and electricity, but beneath the glitter, death was walking at an elegant pace, leaving no district untouched. Before we step further into this fog-lit chapter of America's past, make sure you're subscribed and tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? More shadows wait ahead, and you won't want to miss what they reveal. The first sign was not a body, nor a scream, nor anything so dramatic as the newspapers would later pretend. It was a scent, thin, wandering, almost shy, that drifted along the narrow veins of lower Manhattan as if testing the city's indifference. A sweetness that did not belong to sugar carts or bakery windows, nor to the fashionable perfumes imported for the season. It was quieter than all that. And stranger, those who walked the streets at dusk sometimes paused, wondering if something had spoiled in the drains. Others lifted their collars against it, muttering that New York had never smelled entirely clean. But a few, the ones accustomed to watching shadows rather than lights, felt a prickling at the base of the neck. The sweetness clung too long. It lingered. Beneath the gas lamps, their glass chimneys glowing like small domestic suns, the city rehearsed its nightly routine. Streetcar wheels hissed over rails, horses stamped, impatient. Factory whistles exhaled their last warnings into the oncoming dark. Everything appeared just as it had the night before. Yet the scent moved differently, drifting between brick tenements, slipping through alleyways where laundry lines hung limp in the stagnant summer air. It wove itself through the crush of pedestrians along the Bowery, wrapped itself around the ankles of policemen on patrol, and rose like a faint exhalation from the grates near the riverfront. In a fourth-floor room on Baxter Street, a seamstress named Ellen Dwyer leaned out of her window and frowned. She knew the smells of her neighborhood intimately, the sour tang of spilled beer from the saloon downstairs, the heavy reek of boiled cabbage from the corner kitchen, the dust of too many bodies pressed into too little space. But this sweetness was new. It reminded her faintly of the apple cough syrup mothers fed to feverish children. Only this sweetness held no comfort. It seemed to hover in the back of the throat, refusing either to settle or to disappear. Down on the pavement, the lamps were being lit one by one. The lamplighter, a thin man with a stiff collar and a perpetual stoop, touched flame to wick with mechanical precision. Yet even he, accustomed to the smells of coal, gas, and burning oil, paused tonight. His brow tightened. He glanced over his shoulder as if someone had approached. But no one had. Only the scent drifted past him, languid and pale. At Mulberry Bend, a group of boys playing stickball stopped mid-shout. One of them, the youngest, wrinkled his nose. "Smells funny," he said. The others shrugged, eager to return to their game. But the youngest did not. He stared down the length of the alley, as if expecting to see something emerge from the fog gathering there, something with quiet footsteps and colder intentions. Across the city, in a marble-floored townhouse near Washington Square, a different audience noticed the scent. The evening dress of Mrs. Adelaide Covington, recently imported from Paris, carried the faint sweetness on its hem as she swept through her receiving room. Her guests, freshly powdered and eager to discuss opera tickets and newly installed electric lights, stirred uncomfortably without understanding why. The scent, alien and intrusive, clung briefly to velvet chairs before dissolving. One gentleman remarked that the city air felt oddly close tonight. Mrs. Covington simply laughed, though her gloved hand trembled as she reached for her fan. Meanwhile, in the charity ward of Bellevue Hospital, a nurse named Margaret Hale stood beside a patient whose breath came shallow and irregular. She had smelled the sweetness first that morning, curling near the windows where the panes rattled against their rusted frames. She had not spoken of it. Nurses rarely spoke of anything beyond their duties. But every hour since, more patients arrived from the same neighborhoods, each complaining of dizziness, tightness in the chest, and a warmth behind the eyes that no cool cloth seemed able to relieve. Margaret dipped a cloth in water now, pressing it to the patient's forehead, and the sweetness drifted again across the room. She stiffened. It was stronger here. No alarms rang, no warnings sounded. New York carried on, gilded and restless, unaware that an old enemy had stepped ashore wearing new perfume. Yet in pockets across the city, in a tenement window, a wealthy parlor, a children's alleyway, a hospital ward, people paused, unsettled. They would not remember the scent later, when the death toll mounted and the streets grew pale with fear. But it was there, the first whisper of the plague, gliding beneath the street lamps like a guest who had arrived early for a tragedy not yet announced. The tenement on Baxter and Hester had always complained. Its walls moaned in winter, when frost crept through the cracks like a thief searching for warmth, and they rattled in summer, when the heat swelled the wooden frames until the windows stuck stubbornly in their tracks. But in the weeks after the strange sweetness first drifted through the neighborhood, the building began to tremble in a new, unnerving way, a shiver that seemed to move from brick to brick, as though something inside it had begun to breathe. Families living there were used to discomfort. They slept in narrow beds where children curled like kittens for warmth, cooked thin stews over shared stoves in the hallways, and patched their clothes beneath a single dim kerosene lamp. Poverty was not new. Hardship was not unexpected. But the trembling of the walls that was new. At night, when the building settled, the vibrations seemed almost deliberate, as if the tenement itself were responding to the coughs rising from its overcrowded rooms. On the third floor, the O'Rourkes felt the trembling most. Their room, barely wide enough for the iron bed and washstand, seemed to flutter like a trapped heart. The mother, Maeve, tried to ignore it as she prepared supper, boiling potatoes in a dented tin pot. Her youngest child, Nora, sat on the floor drawing crooked circles in a scrap of newspaper, coughing softly into her sleeve. At first, Maeve blamed the dampness it collected in the corners of the room and never quite left, no matter how fiercely she scrubbed. But the cough grew sharper, more insistent, as if each breath scraped against something unseen. "Cold's going around," Maeve murmured to her husband, though she did not believe her own words. He nodded without looking up. Patrick O'Rourke had returned from the factory pale and unsteady, gripping the doorframe as though the ground were tilting beneath him. He chalked it up to exhaustion. The foreman had demanded longer hours as shipments increased. But exhaustion did not usually come with a sweetness clinging to the back of the throat, nor with the strange trembling underfoot that made him rise from his chair and check whether the floorboards were truly stable. Down the hall, similar scenes unfolded. The Steinberg twins, usually loud enough to make neighbors pound on the walls, lay quiet in their shared cot, their breathing shallow. Old Mrs. Petrov, who had lived in the building since the year of the draft riots, whispered prayers in Russian as she dabbed her forehead with vinegar. Even the tenants who mocked superstition, who shook their heads at old-world cures and muttered about American sensibilities, found themselves uneasy. By the following Monday, the building seemed to pulse with sickness. Doors opened only halfway. Tenants peered out, as though frightened of contaminating the hallway with their presence. The sweetness in the air thickened until even the uninterested noticed it. Coal smoke no longer covered it. Neither did the boil of cabbage from the communal kitchen or the stench from the alley barrels. It rose through the stairwell like invisible fog, brushing against the banisters, clinging to fingertips. Children were the first to falter. The landlord, Mr. Feldman, heard wails echoing through the halls and climbed the steps with a muttered curse about tenants inventing troubles. But when he reached the O'Rourke's room and saw Nora lying limp against her mother's shoulder, her tiny chest fluttering like a candle, about to gutter out, he backed away in silence. Later he told his wife he had felt the building sway, the whole structure, as if something enormous had leaned its weight against it. Across the street, a fruit peddler remarked that the tenement looked tired. A policeman passing by frowned at the number of windows left open, though the weather was cold enough to redden the nose. From the fire escape, laundry hung motionless despite the breeze. Inside, the sickness paced from room to room. Walls that once trembled with life now trembled with fear. Families whispered of draughty windows, bad water, spoiled food, anything but the truth settling over them. For how could they speak of plague? That was a word reserved for old cities across the sea, the ones their parents had fled. But as midnight deepened and the sweetness seeped deeper into the wallpaper, even the bravest tenant knew. The trembling walls were not a warning. They were a countdown. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow had never trusted the air of New York, no matter how many of his colleagues insisted it was no worse than that of London or Paris. He claimed the city exhaled differently, too heavily in the summer, too sharply in the winter, and always with the faint suspicion of something hiding in the soot. When the mysterious sweetness first drifted across the wards of Bellevue, he did not dismiss it the way the senior physicians did. Instead, he stopped mid-sentence during his morning rounds, lifted his head, and inhaled, as though the air itself were speaking. It had a thickness to it that morning, not unlike the scent that rises from freshly laundered linens, clean but too warm, too intimate, and beneath that warmth, a shadowed undertone. Harrow's assistants noticed him pause, but assumed it was fatigue. He seldom slept more than 3 hours at a time, his mind too preoccupied with case notes and medical journals to allow rest. Yet his tired eyes sharpened now. "Do you smell that?" he asked quietly. The younger assistants sniffed obligingly. One shrugged. Another suggested it was ether leaking from the surgical theatre again. Bellevue always smelled of ether. The bottles never stayed tightly stoppered, and the students often spilled more than they used. But Harrow shook his head. "Not ether," he murmured. "Ether announces itself boldly. This is creeping." He continued down the corridor, passing bed after bed where new patients lay with flushed cheeks and trembling hands. Harrow had seen enough fevers to chart their natural progression. But the cases arriving now defied pattern. The patients were breathless yet not wheezing, warm yet not sweating, alert but strangely detached as though drifting somewhere between waking and dream. When he pressed his stethoscope to their chests, he heard not a rattle, nor the expected congestion, but a faint, irregular flutter, like the wings of an exhausted bird. Harrow stopped at the bedside of a young man brought in earlier that morning from a factory on Ludlow Street. "Any complaints before collapse?" he asked the orderly. "Just dizziness, sir," the man replied, folding his cap nervously. Said he felt the air was wrong. The air was wrong. Harrow wrote the phrase in his notebook, though he knew his superiors would roll their eyes if they saw it. American medicine was a proud creature, built on the muscular confidence of a growing nation. It preferred clean explanations, sharp diagnoses, progress measurable by charts and thermometers. Diseases were meant to be conquered, not pondered. Yet Harrow had never been able to ignore anomalies, and the city was full of anomalies now. He left the ward and climbed the narrow staircase leading to the roof. The day was cool, but the sweetness was present even here. It rose from the streets below, carried upward by the heat of coal fires and crowded bodies, mixing with chimney smoke in a haze that glowed faintly in the mid-morning sun. From the roof, Harrow could see the tenements stretching in all directions, red brick hives teeming with unseen lives, unseen illnesses. The city looked restless. A carriage rattled along the street, its wheels striking sparks from the cobblestones. A fruit vendor shouted his prices with forced cheer. But even from above, Harrow sensed something brittle in the movement of the crowd, a tension coiling beneath the ordinary bustle. People paused at corners, glancing about as though listening for a sound only they could hear. When Harrow returned to the ward, he found 2 more patients had arrived, both from the same crowded block in Mulberry Bend. Their conditions matched the others: breathless, flushed, disoriented. His chief physician dismissed the cluster as coincidence. Tenements breed illness, Harrow. Nothing new. But Harrow had spent enough evenings walking those narrow alleys, visiting patients who could not afford the hospital's fees, to know this was not the usual rhythm of sickness. He returned to the young factory worker, now drifting in and out of consciousness. The sweet scent hung around the bed like invisible vapor. Harrow leaned closer, studying the young man's face. His lips were parted slightly, as though thirsting for air that no longer satisfied. "What are you, then?" Harrow whispered under his breath. "Miasma? Infection? Something in between?" The patient stirred, eyes fluttering open. "Doctor," he breathed, "it's in the rooms. It's everywhere." Harrow froze. The sweetness swelled, filling his nostrils. For the first time in years, he felt truly afraid. Not of the illness itself, but of the city, the great restless metropolis that hid too many secrets beneath its polished ambition. Something was unfolding in the air, quiet as fog and twice as patient. And Harrow, alone among his peers, understood. New York was breathing wrong. The evening had begun like any other for Thomas Keegan, a cabman with a fondness for peppermint lozenges and a habit of humming Irish lullabies when the streets grew too quiet. His horse, a patient chestnut mare named Daffodil, trotted steadily along the damp cobblestones as twilight folded itself gently over the city. Lamps flickered awake, one by one, their soft halos trembling in the early spring air. The theaters along Broadway were just beginning to glow, their marquees promising music, laughter, and temporary escape. Thomas never made it to them. He had collected a fare from the Battery, a well-dressed gentleman who complained of dizziness and requested to be taken uptown, slowly, if you please. Thomas obliged. A slow ride meant a few extra minutes of coin, and the gentleman looked pale enough that Thomas pitied him. But by the time they reached Canal Street, the man had slumped sideways, murmuring faintly about the heat, though the evening carried a chill sharp enough to bite. Thomas pulled the cab to a halt, climbed down, and opened the carriage door. "Sir, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice low with concern. The gentleman's face glistened with a sheen of sweat, though his gloved hands were icy to the touch. A strange sweetness lingered in the air inside the cab, subtle at first, then unmistakable as Thomas leaned closer. It crawled into the back of his throat, leaving a metallic aftertaste like bruised fruit left too long in the sun. "Sir, I'm taking you to Bellevue," Thomas decided. But before he could lift the gentleman upright, the man exhaled a shuddering breath and lay still. A silence spread outward from the carriage, as if the street itself were listening. A policeman approached, boots echoing against the pavement. He looked inside, frowned, then stepped backward with a stiffness Thomas had only seen once before. The day cholera touched his childhood neighborhood in Cork. "Don't," the officer muttered, lifting a hand as though to shield himself. "Best, leave him. Someone from the hospital will fetch the body." "But he's still warm," Thomas protested. "He only just—" "I said leave it." The officer's voice cracked, and he darted a glance toward the glowing lamps above. "There's something wrong in the air tonight." Those words clung to Thomas more tightly than the sweetness did. He climbed back onto his seat, intending to drive toward the nearest precinct or anywhere with light and answers, but as he lifted the reins, a wave of dizziness washed over him. The lamps blurred into soft halos. The buildings leaned. Daffodil's ears flicked nervously, as though she sensed the change in her driver. Thomas blinked hard. His lungs felt oddly full, yet starved for breath. The sweetness deepened, winding around him like invisible ivy. "I just need a moment," he whispered, bracing himself against the seat. Moments later, his hands slipped from the reins. Daffodil, well-trained and loyal, slowed to a confused stop near a row of shop fronts. Passers-by saw the cabman slumped sideways, head bowed, as though he had merely fallen asleep after too long a shift. A shopgirl reached up to touch his shoulder and froze. The air around him felt warmer than the night should allow, scented with that same faint sweetness, now drifting through the Lower East Side like a whispered rumor. By the time help was summoned reluctantly, cautiously, Thomas's breathing had dwindled to a precarious flutter. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow arrived minutes later, summoned from Bellevue by the officer who had initially backed away. He examined the gentleman in the carriage, first lifeless. Then he turned to Thomas. The cabman's pulse trembled beneath Harrow's fingertips like a thread unraveling. "It's the same pattern," Harrow murmured, "but faster this time." The officer stepped back again. "Doctor, is it contagious?" Harrow did not answer. Instead, he looked up at the glowing lamps, the trembling halos of light, the faint haze drifting above the street. The sweetness in the air deepened for a single breath, then vanished as if swallowed by the night. "This city," Harrow whispered, "is trying to warn us." But New York gave no warnings, only symptoms. And as Thomas Keegan was lifted from his cab, the city continued its restless hum, oblivious to the small catastrophe that had unfolded beneath its lamps. He would be the first man the newspapers mentioned by name, but he was not the first to fall, nor would he be the last. The Covington residence on West 34th Street had been preparing for the spring ball for nearly 6 weeks, polishing every brass fixture until it shone like morning sunlight, and stuffing every corner with hothouse lilies that perfumed the hall with powdered sweetness. New York's elite arrived in a glitter of silk and diamonds, stepping from their carriages with the languid confidence of people certain tragedy belonged to other neighborhoods, other lives. Violins hummed from the gallery, chandeliers dripped crystal light, and the great staircase curved like a marble river carrying guests upward into a world safe from discomfort, or so they believed. Mrs. Adelaide Covington presided over the evening with her usual serene dignity, her gloved hands moving like pale moths through the air as she greeted each arrival. But she paused for just a heartbeat when she caught a faint scent drifting through the double doors behind the servants, a sweetness, unusual, intrusive, unwelcome. She waved it away with her fan, assuming it must have been a floral arrangement placed too near a heat source. Yet, as she turned back to her guests, a thin unease whispered beneath her ribs. The ballroom shimmered, lace fans fluttered, champagne glasses clinked their crystalline applause. Yet even here, far from the cramped tenements and trembling walls of Mulberry Bend, the sweetness returned faint at first, lingering at the edges of the music like a misplaced note. Several guests exchanged brief glances. Someone murmured that the room felt warm despite the chilled air drifting from the open balcony doors. At 9:30, the orchestra shifted into a waltz, and the floor filled with swirling dresses and gloved hands poised in graceful confidence. The dancers moved in elegant arcs until one figure, a young banker named Bernard Ashfield, hesitated mid-step. His partner laughed lightly, assuming he had miscounted the rhythm, but the laughter died when he pressed a trembling hand to his throat. "Are you quite well, Mr. Ashfield?" she asked. He tried to answer, but the words dissolved. His face had taken on a peculiar color, flushed along the cheekbones, yet strangely pale around the mouth. The sweetness thickened, drifting from him as though rising directly from his breath. Mrs. Covington noticed the stillness forming at the edge of the dance floor. Her fan closed with a sharp snap. "Bernard?" she called softly. But before anyone could reach him, Bernard swayed forward, his hand knocking against a display of lilies. The porcelain vase shattered, the music faltered, and then Bernard collapsed in a soundless heap upon the gleaming parquet floor. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom, as delicate and sharp as broken glass. Guests stepped backward, skirts sweeping against marble, gloves lifting instinctively to mouths. But no one reached for him. The sweetness seemed to rise in a wave, and with it, an unspoken terror that froze even the boldest among them. "Fetch a doctor," Mrs. Covington whispered, though her voice trembled. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow arrived 20 minutes later, summoned from Bellevue by a frantic footman who refused to enter the ballroom twice. When Harrow entered, he paused. The air inside the mansion felt warmer, heavier, carrying that same unmistakable sweetness he had noticed in the hospital wards. It clung to the velvet drapes, hovered around the crystal chandeliers, and lingered at the edges of the guests huddled by the walls. Bernard Ashfield lay where he had fallen, surrounded by a polite circle of horrified onlookers. Harrow knelt, checking pulse and breath. Both were faint enough to make his own lungs tighten. Another case, another pattern, another victim who should not have been struck so swiftly, so publicly, so silently. "He was dancing," someone whispered. "He was well not 10 minutes ago." Harrow stood slowly. "You must clear the room. Now." A few guests gasped. One woman burst into tears. Another asked if it was contagious. Harrow did not answer. He simply looked up at the chandeliers, watching the lights tremble slightly in the thickened air. Mrs. Covington pressed a hand to her throat. Her gloves were damp. "Doctor, what is happening to my city?" Harrow met her eyes, tired, grave, and darkened by the knowledge he could no longer contain. "Something is moving through the air," he said quietly, "and it does not care where you live." The ball, so meticulously arranged, dissolved in a whispering panic. Guests fled into carriages, clutching embroidered handkerchiefs to their faces. Servants extinguished lamps as if lowering the eyes of the house itself. When the final coach pulled away, the grand Covington mansion stood silent, drenched in the fading scent of lilies and something far more deadly. And somewhere deep in the city, unseen and unhurried, the plague continued its quiet walk through the night. The first newsroom to sense that something was amiss was the Evening Herald, a narrow 3-story building tucked between a cigar shop and a pawnbroker on Park Row. Inside, the air always smelled of ink and ambition, sharp, metallic, restless, the scent of young men who believed they could unmask an entire city with nothing more than a notebook and a stubborn will. On most nights, the newsroom buzzed with the usual commotion, typewriters clacking like nervous teeth, editors barking orders, runners darting in and out with bundles of telegraph slips. But on the evening after the Covington ball fell into panic, the newsroom felt different, too quiet, too expectant. Samuel Sully Hartman, a reporter barely past 30 with clever eyes and a permanently ink-stained cuff, was the first to notice. He sat hunched at his desk, sorting through routine stories, a labor strike rumored on the docks, a minor scandal involving a city alderman, when a new scent slipped through the open window behind him. Sweet, warm, faintly rotten at the edges. Sully wrinkled his nose. "Printer's glue again?" called one of the copy boys. "No," Sully murmured. "This is something else." Moments later, a runner burst through the door with a message from the police precinct near Mulberry Bend. A cabman had collapsed in the street, a gentleman dead in his carriage. Both cases dispatched to Bellevue. The note was brief, factual, and yet a tremor seemed to run beneath the words. Sully grabbed his coat. Within minutes, he and 2 other Herald reporters were heading toward the precinct, their footsteps echoing across the cold pavement. The gas lamps cast long shadows that bent unnaturally as they walked, and with each block the sweet scent grew stronger, threading itself through the air like a silk ribbon being pulled taut. "You smell that?" murmured Elijah Morris, a quiet young writer whose calm demeanor made him unnervingly perceptive. "All night," Sully replied, "as if the city's been steeped in syrup." Elijah's brow creased. "But there's no bakery near here." They reached the precinct doors just as a policeman stepped outside for air. He recognized Sully and stiffened instinctively. Reporters were vultures in the eyes of the police, necessary but unwelcome. Still, the officer's face was drained of its usual irritation. "Bellevue took them both," he said without waiting to be asked. "The gentleman didn't last, the cabman slipping." "What happened?" Sully pressed. The officer hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the street lamps as though expecting something to descend from them. "They breathed wrong," he said finally, like the air was choking them. And there was this smell, like fruit left too long on a warm shelf. Sully and Elijah exchanged a look. Back at the Evening Herald, editor Charles Stokes had already begun pacing, sensing the shift long before he admitted it aloud. When the reporters returned, breathless and smelling faintly of the sweetness themselves, Stokes demanded details. They told him everything: the fallen cabman, the trembling police officer, the strange scent hovering in the night air. Stokes's face paled beneath the lamplight. "This is no ordinary fever," he said. "It might not be fever at all," Sully whispered. The editor paused mid-stride. "Are we printing it?" Silence fell. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a listening ear. "Yes," Sully said finally, but carefully. "Too much truth too soon, and the city will panic. Too little, and they'll die believing nothing is wrong." The decision settled heavily over the newsroom. Typewriters stirred to life again, but their clacking now sounded like warnings tapping against coffin lids. As Sully began drafting the article, the sweetness drifted into the room once more, stronger this time, as if the city itself had leaned in to read over his shoulder. He stopped typing and looked out across the darkened streets. The reporters had smelled a story. They had not yet realized the story had smelled them back. The night ward at Bellevue had always been a place of uneasy hush. Even in winter, when breath fogged against the window panes and blankets had to be rationed, the ward held a steady rhythm: the slow pulse of lamplight, the rustle of nurses' skirts, the quiet groans of patients drifting in and out of fever dreams. But in the week after the Covington ball collapsed into scandalous silence, the ward began to swell like a lung filling too quickly, too painfully, until the very air quivered beneath its burden. It began shortly after dusk. A single stretcher arrived, carried by 2 exhausted orderlies whose boots left streaks of river mud along the floor. The patient, a woman from Mulberry Bend, trembled uncontrollably, her breaths shallow, each one coaxed through lips tinged a faint violet. Nurse Margaret Hale met them at the door, her apron already smudged with the day's labors. "Another from the Bend?" she asked, though her voice betrayed no surprise. "Yes," the orderly replied. "Same symptoms as the others." Margaret guided the stretcher toward the row of empty beds along the northern wall. But before she could return to her station, another stretcher arrived. Then a third, then a fourth: older men, young women, factory boys still in soot-stained shirts, a seamstress who had collapsed at her sewing wheel, her fingers still pricked with needles. Within an hour, the row of empty beds was full. Within 2 hours, the hallways were full. By midnight, the ward had begun turning people away. The air grew thick, not just with the scent of antiseptics and body heat, but with that eerie sweetness that clung to the hospital like a second atmosphere. It slid between the metal bed frames, drifted along the rafters, curled beneath Margaret's collar like an unwelcome whisper. Several times she paused, pressing a hand to her throat. The sweetness weighed there, teasing the edge of nausea. Still, she worked. She checked pulses that fluttered like cornered birds. She wiped foreheads burning with inexplicable heat. She adjusted pillows for patients who could no longer lift their own heads. She whispered reassurance she did not believe. At the far end of the ward, Dr. Harrow moved from bed to bed with a controlled urgency that belied his exhaustion. He muttered notes to himself, his brow tight with the same unspoken fear that had been shadowing him for days. The patients all followed the same pattern: dizziness, breathlessness, a warmth that rose suddenly and violently. No cough, no rash, no congestion, no explanation. "This cannot be coincidence," he murmured to Margaret, as another patient was brought in, a butcher's apprentice, bare-chested and gasping. "What do you think it is?" she whispered. Harrow exhaled slowly. Something in the air. Her expression tightened. "The doctors on the upper floor say it's nothing more than influenza." "The doctors on the upper floor," Harrow said bitterly, "have not walked the alleys at night." A groan rose from behind them. A young woman had begun convulsing, her fingers clawing at the sheet as though trying to hold herself to the world. Margaret rushed to her side, but the woman's breaths came too fast, too shallow, like a candle flickering wildly before extinguishing itself. The convulsions stopped. The stillness that followed seemed to stretch across the entire ward. The sweetness thickened. Someone sobbed. Someone prayed. Someone whispered that they should leave, that the air was poisoned, that it was madness to stay. But Margaret stayed. Harrow stayed. The nurses, trembling but resolute, stayed. Around 3 in the morning, the final blow came. A wagon, its wheels squealing beneath the weight of bodies, pulled up to the hospital's side door. The attendants called for help unloading. There were too many. Far too many. "Where did they come from?" Harrow demanded. "Everywhere," one attendant replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "The city's coughing people out like a dying beast." Harrow closed his eyes. Margaret gripped the bedpost to steady herself. The night ward bulged outward again, spilling into corridors, stairwells, storage rooms. Lamps burned low, sheets ran out. Water basins emptied faster than they could be filled. Somewhere beyond the walls, dawn was beginning to stir, a pale smear of light across a city drowning in its own breath. But inside the ward, time felt trapped, heavy, unmoving, sweet. And as Margaret leaned over another patient, trying desperately to steady his breath, she realized with a cold shudder. The ward had not merely overflowed with the sick. It had begun to overflow with the dead. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow had always kept his office in meticulous order. Even on the most frantic nights, when Bellevue's corridors pulsed with urgency and the wards howled with fever, his desk remained a quiet island, papers stacked neatly, scalpel polished, stethoscope coiled like a sleeping silver serpent. But on the morning after the night ward overflowed, Harrow stood frozen in his doorway, staring at a single object that did not belong. A small brown bottle, uncorked, sitting atop his ledger. Ether. He recognized the scent before he even crossed the threshold. Ether had its own kind of sweetness, sharp, medicinal, insistent, a scent that clung to gloves and aprons long after procedures ended. But the sweetness rising from this bottle felt altered somehow, as though something had settled into the fumes overnight and warmed itself there like a guest too comfortable to leave. Harrow stepped closer. The room felt warmer than usual. The lamplight wavered even though no draught touched the glass. He could hear the distant murmur of nurses moving through the ward, but their footsteps sounded muffled, as though drifting from a great distance. He touched the bottle. The glass was warm. Not warm from hands, warm from within. He snatched his hand back. The sweetness thickened, sliding beneath the door like invisible smoke and mingling with the faint scent of paper and ink. Harrow covered the bottle with a cloth and sat heavily in his chair, pulse quickening. "Ether does not warm itself," he muttered. "Something is wrong." He opened his ledger. His handwriting, steady even during chaos, slanted wildly across the last page, where he had attempted to describe the previous night's wave of patients. Breathlessness, progressive. No cough. Rapid decline. Sudden collapse. He tapped the quill against the margin. What connected them all? Not water, not food, not physical proximity. Air. The air itself. A faint knock pulled him from his thoughts. Margaret Hale stepped inside, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, her cap askew. She hesitated when she saw the covered bottle, then shifted her gaze toward the window. "Another wagon is coming," she said quietly. "More from the Bend, and 2 from the Bowery." Harrow rubbed his temples. "Are they presenting the same symptoms?" "All but one." He looked up sharply. "What of the other?" Margaret swallowed. He was delirious. Spoke of something. Following him. Said the sweetness kept crawling into his lungs. Asked me if air could watch. The lamplight flickered again. Harrow's jaw tightened. "And what did you tell him?" "That the fever was speaking. But," she lowered her voice, "Doctor, I smelled it in the ward last night. Stronger than ever. It clung to the sheets. It seemed to come from everywhere at once." Harrow leaned forward. "Margaret, this is not influenza. It is not consumption. The symptoms do not match any illness I know." She met his gaze, fear flickering across her features. "Then what is it?" He hesitated. "A contagion of the air, perhaps. Something inhaled. Something new." Margaret clasped her hands together. "But the bottle, what does that mean?" Harrow lifted the cloth. The sweetness that escaped swelled like breath from a living thing. Margaret stepped back. "Doctor, this bottle was left open," Harrow said. "Someone used it. Someone set it here. But no one should have been in my office." Margaret shook her head. "The nurses were all in the ward. The students were assisting in surgery. No one came this way." "Then who left it?" The question settled heavily between them. Harrow corked the bottle with a decisive movement. "This stays between us. If the board hears of this, they will dismiss it as hysteria, and dismiss me along with it." Margaret nodded, though her eyes lingered on the place where the bottle had sat. The warmth seemed to throb faintly, as though the ether fumes still remembered the shape of the glass. A cry rose from the corridor, sharp, panicked. Margaret turned instantly. "They've brought another one." Harrow grabbed his bag. "We will speak again later." But as he followed her into the hall, he cast one last glance at the table. The bottle was gone. The cloth lay untouched. Harrow felt his chest tighten. The sweetness in the air deepened, pulsing like a heartbeat. For the first time, he wondered if the illness was not merely moving through the city, but creeping closer to him, step by step, breath by breath. The Board of Health assembled on a fog-heavy morning, when the sweetness clung low over the streets like a perfumed mist, too shy to rise. Their meeting chamber, a long mahogany-paneled room overlooking Broadway, was meant to inspire confidence. High ceilings, polished brass fixtures, portraits of former commissioners rendered in firm, untroubled strokes. But as the members gathered that day, the room felt smaller, its air thick enough to taste. Commissioner Alistair Pembroke, a man whose moustache carried more authority than his decisions, rapped his cane against the floor. "Order, gentlemen, order." His voice trembled slightly, though he tried to mask it with pomp. "We convene to discuss rumors circulating throughout the city. Rumors. I stress. Around the table, board members shifted uneasily. Some dabbed their brows with embroidered handkerchiefs, though the room was cold. Others exchanged glances that revealed the truth they tried to bury. They too had smelled it, that strange sweetness drifting through neighborhoods far removed from the tenements. Dr. Harrow stood among them, invited only reluctantly at the insistence of a single sympathetic commissioner. His coat was still dusted with the night ward's exhaustion. His hands bore faint traces of ink from notes scribbled in desperation, and his expression carried the quiet fury of a man who had seen too much. Pembroke cleared his throat. "Doctor, you may begin your report. Concise, if you please." Harrow's gaze swept the assembled men. "What is happening in this city is not influenza. It is not miasma in the traditional sense. It may be something entirely new." He spoke plainly, without theatrics. Patients arrive breathless. They collapse without fever. Their lungs fail without struggle. A murmur rippled across the room. Pembroke raised a hand. "Doctor, with respect, you are describing symptoms common to many seasonal illnesses." "No," Harrow said firmly. "These cases do not follow any known pattern. They escalate within minutes, not days. And," he hesitated, "there is the scent." Several commissioners stiffened. Pembroke exhaled sharply. "Ah, yes, the sweetness, some have reported. Surely you do not mean to suggest the illness has a smell?" Harrow leaned forward. "It precedes every collapse I've witnessed. It lingers on the patient's clothing. It saturates the night ward, and it is growing stronger." A silence settled, heavy and suffocating. At last, Commissioner Willoughby, an older man known for his caution, whispered, "My wife smelled it last night, thought it was the lilies on the table." But the flowers were fresh. Another leaned in. "A clerk at my office fainted yesterday. He said the air felt thick, sweet." Pembroke silenced them with a glare. "Gentlemen, the city cannot afford panic. Theatre attendance is down, carriage fares are falling. If we acknowledge an airborne plague without proof, we doom our own economy." Harrow's jaw tightened. "With respect, Commissioner, people are dying. Whatever this is, it is not contained. Closing your eyes will not save this city." "Then what do you propose?" Pembroke barked. "Evacuations? Quarantines? Public alarm?" Harrow did not yield. "Open the windows of every public building. Improve ventilation. Stop pretending the air is harmless." A wave of discomfort swept the board. Pembroke slammed his cane down. "Absolutely not. Open windows invite drafts. Drafts breed illness. We will keep them shut." Harrow stared at him in disbelief. "Shutting the windows traps the very thing that's killing them." "The windows stay closed," Pembroke repeated. "This board will not stoke fear with theatrics." The sweetness drifted, then faint but unmistakable through the seams of the room's old wooden frame. Several men coughed. One pressed a trembling hand to his chest. Harrow watched them, a cold certainty settling in his bones. "You cannot keep it out," he said quietly, "and you cannot keep it in. The air has already chosen its path." Pembroke bristled. "This meeting is adjourned." The commissioners fled the room with more haste than dignity, clutching handkerchiefs to their faces as though the cloth alone could shield them. Harrow stood alone for a moment, staring at the shuttered windows. Not a crack of air slipped through. The glass reflected the grey fog outside, turning the room into a box of stale breath and fearful men. He walked out, but before closing the door behind him, he looked back once more. The sweetness lingered, and the decision to seal the windows had only ensured one thing. New York had closed itself in with its own undoing. The city morgue on 26th Street had always possessed a kind of solemn efficiency. Its stone walls absorbed the city's noise, leaving only the echo of footsteps and the distant clatter of carriage wheels. Inside, the air was cold by necessity, touched by the faint smell of carbolic acid and the metallic whisper of steel instruments resting on marble trays. Yet even here, in a place built for the quiet accounting of the dead, the sweetness found its way in. It arrived first as a delicate thread in the morning air, drifting through the cracked transom window, as though searching for a resting place. By the end of the week, it had thickened into a gauzy haze that clung to the examining tables like an invisible veil. And the bodies began to come faster. Jonathan Whitlock, chief mortuary attendant for nearly 20 years, noticed the change long before he dared speak of it. He was a methodical man, unshaken by spectacle, who recorded each death in a ledger with neat, unwavering script. But on Tuesday morning, as he turned the pages, he paused. The column for causes of death, a field usually filled with familiar words such as consumption, injury, or apoplexy, now bristled with uncertainty. Sudden collapse, he had written 3 times, respiratory failure, unexplained fainting, asphyxic episode. No patterns, yet too many similarities. And always that lingering sweetness. When the first wagon arrived before sunrise, Whitlock straightened his coat and prepared himself. But when he opened the rear doors, he froze. The bodies were wrapped in sheets damp with condensation, as if some unseen heat had risen from them despite the cool night air. Their faces, pale and slack, appeared oddly peaceful, a detail that unsettled him more than any expression of agony could have. He swallowed, then motioned for the younger attendants to help him. They carried the bodies inside, the sweetness seeming to follow with each step. The attendants exchanged uneasy glances. One muttered something about the air being too thick today. By mid-morning, a second wagon arrived. Then a third. By noon, the morgue had surpassed its typical daily capacity. Whitlock opened his ledger again, hands trembling. The numbers no longer fit within the confines of the page. They began pressing outward, demanding new lines, new columns, new explanations. Dr. Harrow arrived shortly after the 4th wagon. His face looked carved from sleeplessness. The skin beneath his eyes had taken on the dull bruise of exhaustion. He removed his gloves slowly, as if buying himself a few seconds before confronting what waited. "Jonathan," he said softly. "How many?" Whitlock hesitated. 22, since dawn." Harrow exhaled sharply. 22? "And more coming," Whitlock whispered. He led Harrow to one of the examining tables. "Look here," he murmured, pulling back the sheet. Skin flushed, lungs without fluid, no sign of struggle. Whatever this is, it takes them quickly, almost gently. Harrow leaned in. The sweetness hovered above the body like a memory, faint but unmistakable. "It's the same pattern," he said. "They breathe it in, and it takes them." Whitlock closed the ledger with a slow, deliberate motion. "Doctor, the numbers are doubling. Every day." Another knock echoed through the morgue, the 5th wagon. Harrow's shoulders tensed. "The board will not act." "I heard," Whitlock replied. "Closed windows." He shook his head. "We are sealing the city into its own grave." A distant cry rose from outside, the wail of a woman discovering her husband will not wake. It seeped into the morgue like a draught, curling around the examining tables. Harrow walked toward the door. "I must return to the hospital." Whitlock stopped him. "Doctor, how many will it take before they listen?" Harrow looked around the morgue, the quiet rows, the still forms, the sweetness gathering like a silent congregation. "More than this," he whispered. "More than we can bear." As Harrow left, Whitlock returned to the ledger. His pen hovered above the page. The ink shimmered in the lamplight, trembling slightly, or perhaps it was his hand. He wrote 23. The sweetness deepened, and the morgue, built to receive the city's forgotten, realized with quiet dread that it would soon be forced to remember far more than it ever had before. The Staten Island ferry cut across the darkening harbor like a slow, sighing beast, its wooden belly groaning with the weight of commuters eager to leave Manhattan's restless breath behind them. The evening fog draped itself over the deck rails, soft as cotton wool, swallowing the lamps one by one until their glow resembled distant stars trapped beneath glass. Most passengers welcomed the fog. It softened the city's harsh skyline, blurring the factories and chimneys into a watercolor haze. But that night, the fog carried something else with it, something sweeter. Something wrong. The sweetness drifted first across the upper deck, mingling with the scent of wet rope and engine grease. A businessman leaning against the railing frowned and lifted a handkerchief to his nose. Strange smell, he muttered to no one in particular. Not the sea, but the others nearby dismissed it. They blamed the dockyards, the tannery smoke, the crates of produce stored below. New Yorkers were accustomed to odors that shifted like moods, sharp one moment, sour the next. A little sweetness was hardly worth remarking. Yet the smell lingered. It clung to coat collars, buttonholes, gloved fingertips resting lightly on railings. It drifted beneath scarves and settled at the base of the throat like a drop of warm syrup. On the lower deck, schoolchildren returning home fidgeted on the benches. One girl, no older than 10, pressed her hands to her chest and whispered, "I can't breathe right." Her teacher hushed her gently, insisting it was only the damp air. But the girl's eyes widened, reflecting the faint lamplight in a way that made the teacher's stomach twist. Across the aisle, a young mother rocked her infant. The baby's face flushed, though the night was cool. She loosened the blanket, then tightened it again, uncertain. The sweetness seemed to cling to the child's breath. She looked around, but no one else appeared alarmed. She decided she must be imagining it. The fog thickened. The ferry's bell tolled. And then the first man collapsed. He was tall, a clerk by the look of him, his leather satchel still strapped across his chest. One moment he was standing. The next, he dropped to his knees with a soft thud that echoed strangely in the muffled night. A woman screamed. The satchel spilled open, scattering ink pens and ledger sheets across the floor. Passengers surged backward. The sweetness swelled, reacting almost hungrily to the panic. "Make room!" shouted a ferry attendant, though his own voice quavered as he approached the fallen man. He knelt, pressed fingers to the clerk's throat, then drew back as if burned. No pulse, not even a tremor of breath. Someone called for a doctor, but there was none aboard. Just ordinary people with ordinary fears, now staring at the body lying at their feet as if it had revealed something terrible about the world they believed they understood. On the upper deck, the businessman who had first noticed the scent suddenly doubled over, gripping the railing with white-knuckled fingers. His breath came in rapid, shallow bursts. A woman beside him placed a hand on his back and froze. The sweetness rose again. Passengers rushed toward the stairs, desperate to reach the crew cabin, the captain, anyone who could help. But their footsteps faltered. Several clung to the walls, stunned by dizziness they could not explain. The ferry did not speed up. The captain, oblivious to the unfolding disaster below, kept his steady course across the black water. He saw only fog, not the silent storm forming within his vessel. When they finally reached the Staten Island dock, the attendants lowered the ramp with trembling hands. The passengers surged forward in a frantic tide, many coughing, gasping, clutching children who cried without understanding why their mother's arms shook so violently. 2 bodies remained aboard the clerk and the businessman, now slumped against the railing as if merely watching the wake. The sweetness gradually dissipated into the night air. Later, when reporters questioned those who had been on the ferry, every witness described the same sensation. The air had felt wrong, heavy, sweet, as though the city itself had crossed the harbor with them. The ferry operators scrubbed the decks, aired the cabins, and insisted it had been an unfortunate coincidence, 2 men falling ill at the same time. But on the return trip to Manhattan the next morning, several passengers noticed a faint scent rising from the wooden floorboards. Warm, sweet, waiting. The ferry had carried more than commuters across the harbor. It had carried the first breath of a plague that did not know the meaning of distance. Dawn usually arrived reluctantly over Mulberry Bend, slipping shyly between the crooked rooftops and the sagging fire escapes, softening the filth that clung stubbornly to the alleys. But on the morning after the ferry tragedy, dawn refused to come. The sky greyed but never brightened, as if the sun itself hesitated to cast its light upon the slum. Lamps flickered long past sunrise, their halos trembling in an air that felt too warm, too heavy, too sweet. The tenants of No. 14 Mulberry woke, or rather, stirred to a silence that felt unnatural. Babies who typically wailed at first light lay quiet. The usual clatter of coal scuttles and breakfast pots was absent. Even the rats, bold creatures that they were, stayed hidden, as though sensing a predator loose in the dark. Mrs. Rosalinda Moretti, who lived on the ground floor with her 3 children, was the first to open her door. She stepped into the hallway, expecting the familiar chaos. Children racing past, neighbors shouting in Sicilian or Irish, arguments floating down from the stairwell. Instead, she found emptiness. The hallway seemed to sway under her feet, though the floor remained still. The sweetness drifted around her, warm and syrupy, the same scent she had noticed the night before, clinging to her children's blankets. She knocked on the door across from hers. "Signora, are you awake?" Silence. She pushed the door open slowly. The family inside, a young couple and their infant son, lay as though asleep, but their stillness was too deep, too absolute. Rosalinda felt the blood drain from her face. She backed out of the room, hand pressed to her chest, breath coming fast. On the second floor, the O'Malley brothers had failed to rise for their bakery shift, something their neighbors found odd, for they were reliable men, early risers, known for singing loudly before dawn. When their door was forced open, the brothers were found slumped at the table, the remains of last night's supper untouched, the sweetness hovering above them like invisible smoke. A crowd gathered in the stairwell. Men whispered prayers. Women shushed crying children with trembling hands. Someone ran to fetch the priest from the mission house, but he never arrived. He collapsed on the doorstep before reaching his shoes. The slum seemed to pulse with dread. Room after room revealed the same scene. Families gone quiet in the night, their bodies warm but lifeless, as though sleep itself had grown greedy and refused to release them. By mid-morning, panic had set in. "Close the doors," someone shouted. "Seal the windows." "No, open them, the air is poisoned." "The air is all we have." People argued, wept, prayed. Children clung to their mothers. Men stumbled through the halls, clutching handkerchiefs to their faces. Yet no matter how tightly they pressed cloth to skin, the sweetness seeped through. On the top floor, old Mrs. Petrov sat rocking in her chair, staring out her window at the grey sky. She whispered in her native tongue, repeating a single phrase, "The air is hungry." A doctor arrived, not Harrow, but a younger physician from a nearby dispensary, who had not yet seen what Bellevue had seen. He stepped inside, breathed once, and froze. The sweetness wrapped around him like a scarf. "What happened here?" he asked. Rosalinda pointed weakly toward the stairwell lined with bodies. "It happened in the dark," she said. "The night took them." The doctor staggered back. "No illness moves this fast." But the slum answered him in silence, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow sound itself. By the time Harrow arrived, summoned by a frantic runner from the Herald, the hallway was lined with sheets covering the dead. Margaret Hale trailed behind him, her face pale with shock as she surveyed the disaster. "This is not a cluster," Harrow whispered. "This is a sweep." Margaret stepped closer to a doorway and felt the sweetness brush her cheek like a living breath. "Doctor, how did it choose?" Harrow closed his eyes. "It didn't choose," he said. "It simply flowed." Outside, the sun remained reluctant, barely breaking through the haze. Morning had come to Mulberry Bend, but inside the slum, it was still night. and for many, it would remain night forever. Dr. Elias Rudd had always been a meticulous man, the kind of physician who sharpened his quills twice before writing, who labeled every specimen jar with elegant script, and who believed that every illness yielded its secrets to careful observation. But on the night he burned his notes, the flames revealed more about him than the ink ever had. Rudd lived above his private practice on Broome Street, a narrow brick building wedged between a boarding house and a tailor's shop. On ordinary evenings, he could hear the muffled hum of the city below, carriage wheels striking cobblestone, shopkeepers shouting final offers, the distant rattle of police patrols. But tonight, the street lay eerily hushed, as though New York had drawn a breath and forgotten to release it. The sweetness drifted into his rooms long before he noticed it, faint at first, like warm sugar dissolving in tea, then thicker, clinging to the drapes and papers on his desk. He paused mid-sentence, pen hovering above his ledger, and inhaled. There it was again. Subtle, soft, unnatural. He had smelled it days earlier at Bellevue, when he went to consult on a puzzling case, a seamstress who collapsed without fever, warning, or physical trauma. And he had smelled it yesterday, when a patient slumped lifeless in the waiting chair before he could even unbutton his collar. Now it had found him in his own home, uninvited and unannounced, drifting through the cracks in the window frame as if following the trail of his curiosity. He set down his pen. The ledger lay before him, filled with his tireless observations. Breaths shallow, lungs oddly light, sweet odor preceding collapse. Rapid decline, no agitation. Possible airborne vector. He stared at the page and felt his pulse quicken. If this illness was truly in the air, if it moved freely, without regard for class, district, or distance, then the city was not merely troubled, it was doomed. A soft knock came from downstairs. Rudd startled, then composed himself. He descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing in the unnaturally still air. A woman in shawl and gloves stood at his door, her face pale beneath the flickering street lamp. "Doctor," she whispered, "please. My husband, he cannot breathe." Rudd ushered her inside. "Where is he?" "In the carriage." Rudd stepped outside. The sweetness struck him immediately, thicker than before. The man slumped in the carriage seat was already losing consciousness, his skin flushed with that same unsettling warmth. Rudd felt the shift, the sudden heaviness in his own chest. The sweetness pressed against him, as if testing him. He recoiled. "Bring him inside," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew the man was too far gone. Moments later, the patient's head lolled back, breath vanishing into the night. The widow's wail pierced the stillness. Rudd stepped back, shaken. He had seen death countless times, but never like this, swift, silent, indifferent. He returned to his study, closing the door behind him. The sweetness pooled heavily in the room now, settling on his papers like invisible dust. He stared again at his notes. They no longer looked like scientific observations. They looked like warnings. He gathered the pages in trembling hands. There were so many diagrams, hypotheses, descriptions of the scent, sketches of lungs that should not have appeared as empty as they did. He hesitated. If the board saw these, they would dismiss him. If the public saw them, panic would follow. And if the truth was exactly what he feared, then the city needed hope more desperately than it needed accuracy. Hope, or the illusion of it. Rudd struck a match. The flame shivered for a moment, then grew bold. He touched it to the first page. The ink curled, blackening as the paper turned to ember. The fire spread quickly from one sheet to another, each page surrendering with a soft hiss, as though relieved to be relieved of its burden. He watched until the last scrap collapsed into ash. The sweetness lingered, faintly triumphant. Rudd sank into his chair, staring at the dying flames. He had destroyed his evidence. But he had not escaped its meaning. From the alley below, he heard coughing, 2, 3 sharp gasps in the dark. Then silence. He closed the window. It made no difference. The air in New York was already claimed. The night shift was supposed to end at 6. At Bellevue, the rising sun usually meant a chorus of weary goodbyes, the rustle of aprons being untied, and the first sighs of relief as nurses stepped out into the morning air. But on the morning after the slum tragedy, Nurse Margaret Hale remained at her post long after the clocks chimed 6, then 7, then 8. Her colleagues urged her to rest, to lie down, to eat something, anything, yet she shook her head every time. "I can't," she whispered. "They're still coming." And they were. One after another, the bodies arrived, some breathing, some not, all carrying that same faint sweetness that Margaret now instinctively associated with danger. It hung over the ward like a curse, settling into the folds of sheets, seeping into hair and clothing, wrapping itself around the gas lamps until their glow looked distorted, sickly, as though dimmed by invisible hands. Margaret moved between beds with steady steps, though her vision blurred from exhaustion. Her apron, once crisp and white, now bore the creases and stains of relentless labor. She adjusted pillows, wiped cooled foreheads, lifted trembling hands, whispered reassurance in languages she did not speak. Her voice remained calm, even as her heart beat a frantic rhythm beneath her collar. "Miss Hale," murmured one of the younger nurses, her eyes red from crying. "You should rest. We all should." Margaret glanced around the ward. Every bed was filled. Every hallway lined with stretchers. Every corner claimed by shadows shaped like bodies. "There's no time for rest," she said. "If we leave, who stays?" The younger nurse swallowed, unable to answer. Margaret continued her rounds. At the far end of the ward, a boy no older than 12 gasped for breath. His mother clutched his hands so tightly their knuckles blanched. "Please," the mother begged. "Help him." Margaret knelt beside the boy. His pupils were unfocused, drifting toward the ceiling as though seeing something she could not. The sweetness hovered thickly over him, like a warm mist rising from his chest. She checked his pulse. Fluttering, weak, slipping. "Stay with me," she whispered, brushing damp curls from his forehead. "You're safe." A lie, and she knew it. Safety had left New York days ago. Behind her, Dr. Harrow approached, his face drawn. "How many more?" "7 since dawn," Margaret said softly. 3 already gone." He closed his eyes. "It's accelerating." She didn't need him to confirm it, she could feel it. The ward itself seemed to throb with the rhythm of the plague, as though the sweetness had sunk into the very wood and iron of the building. A crash sounded from the corridor. 2 orderlies rushed in, carrying a man who convulsed violently, his limbs jerking with eerie silence, no scream, no plea, just the frantic twitching of a body losing its fight. "Put him here," Margaret said, clearing a table with one sweep of her arm. The man's wife followed, trembling, her hands clasped to her mouth. "He was fine yesterday," she whispered. "Perfectly fine. He said something about the air being sweet and—" Her voice broke. She collapsed into a nearby chair. As Harrow examined the patient, Margaret noticed something new. The sweetness around this one was stronger, almost suffocating. It curled in her nostrils and sat heavy on her tongue, as though trying to enter her lungs by force. She stepped back. Harrow noticed. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she lied. He studied her, but said nothing. A sudden cough tore from a patient behind them, a deep, rattling sound that felt out of place amidst the usual shallow gasps. Margaret turned. The woman in the bed had sat upright, eyes wide, fingers digging into the sheet. "Help me," she rasped. "The air." Margaret was at her side instantly, but the woman's body seized, her eyes rolled back. The sweetness thickened. 2 more coughs echoed from across the room. Margaret froze. The pattern had changed. The illness was no longer content to drift quietly. It was beginning to show its teeth. "Doctor," she whispered, "what do we do?" Harrow stared at the ward packed, trembling, suffocating under the invisible weight of the plague. "There's nothing to do," he said, voice barely audible, "except stay." Margaret swallowed hard. She stayed. She stayed when the other nurses fled for air, when the orderlies requested leave, when the lamps flickered as though choking on the sweetness themselves. She stayed until her fingers trembled and her knees threatened to give way. Because if she left, the ward would be empty, and the plague-indifferent, patient, sweet, would claim them all without witness. Margaret Hale refused to let them die unseen. The Prescott townhouse on Madison Avenue had always prided itself on refinement. Its parlor, a cavern of velvet drapery, oil portraits, and imported carpets thick enough to swallow footsteps, was the crown jewel of Mrs. Eleanor Prescott's social kingdom. Here, gossip glittered like champagne bubbles, and every visitor left believing themselves a shade more important than when they arrived. But on the morning the sweetness seeped into the Prescott home, refinement curdled into quiet dread. Eleanor had risen early to supervise the arrangement of her weekly ladies' tea, a ritual as essential to her as breathing. The servants bustled about polishing brass sconces and trimming the wicks of the crystal lamps. By 10 o'clock, the parlor shimmered with the warm glow of civility. Every cushion puffed, every lace-cloth pressed, every perfume drifting from every satin sleeve was chosen with precision. Yet beneath the familiar fragrances, rose water, lavender oil, citrus cologne, something else stirred. A sweetness. A faint, warm, cloying sweetness. Eleanor noticed it first as she adjusted a vase of lilies on the mantelpiece. She frowned delicately. "Thomas," she called to the footman, "these lilies have turned. Remove them." Thomas sniffed the air, puzzled. "They're fresh this morning, madam." "Then something else is spoiling," Eleanor said sharply. She disliked imprecision almost as much as she disliked surprises. By noon, the guests arrived, 12 women adorned in jewels heavy enough to require perfect posture. They seated themselves on embroidered chairs, opening and closing their fans with practiced elegance. But as the tea cooling in their porcelain cups grew untouched, a shared unease swept through them. "That scent again," muttered Mrs. Wixom, lifting a lace glove to her nose. "Indeed," whispered Mrs. Latham. "I thought it was my maid's perfume, but it's different, quite different." Eleanor forced a smile. "It's merely the weather. Humidity always stirs odors." But the women were unconvinced. The sweetness did not behave like any ordinary scent. It lingered too long, hovered too close, pressing gently upon their lungs. Even the footmen shifted awkwardly, as though the air pulled strangely against their breath. Conversation resumed only in timid murmurs. "What happened at that Covington ball?" Mrs. Harland began, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Surely it was nerves. These young men do drink excessively." "Nerves do not stop hearts," Mrs. Wixom retorted. "And that ferry incident?" added another. "2 men dead within moments of one another. Unthinkable." "Tosh," Eleanor interrupted, though her voice cracked. "Coincidence is dramatic in retrospect." But the room did not believe her, and neither, if she was honest, did she. As the ladies debated the city's misfortunes, one of them, Miss Lavinia Pike, reached for her cup and paused. Her hand trembled. She blinked rapidly, as though the edges of the room had grown soft. "Are you unwell, Miss Pike?" Eleanor asked. The air feels thick," Lavinia whispered. "Do open a window." Eleanor stiffened. "Absolutely not. Drafts bring illness. You know this." Yet the sweetness surged at that moment, palpable enough that several guests recoiled. Lavinia stood abruptly, swayed, and collapsed in a rustle of silk onto the carpet. Her fan clattered beside her like a discarded birdwing. Screams shattered the parlor's practiced elegance. Thomas rushed forward. Mrs. Latham sank onto a sofa in fainting terror. Eleanor froze, her gloved hands trembling as the sweetness swelled around Lavinia's body. Her breath, her skin, her very presence released the scent. "Call a doctor!" someone cried. But when Harrow arrived, summoned from Bellevue with frantic urgency, he found the parlor transformed. No longer a sanctuary of refinement, but a suffocating chamber heavy with fear. The damned sweetness clung to everything. The velvet curtains, the polished furniture, the very ribbons in the women's hair. He kneeled beside Lavinia, felt for a pulse, and shook his head. "She's gone," he said quietly. One of the ladies let out a choked sob. Another covered her face. Eleanor gripped the back of a chair for balance. "Doctor," she whispered, desperate for reassurance. "What killed her?" Harrow looked around the room, crowded, sealed, saturated with everything the board insisted was safe. "The air," he said finally. "The air did." The guests stared at him in trembling silence. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Prescott found herself wishing for a draught. But the windows remained shut, trapping the sweetness inside the parlor like a guest no one had invited, a guest who had no intention of leaving. And above them all, the chandelier flickered as though breathing with the room. Inspector Theodore Brannigan had patrolled the narrow arteries of Manhattan for nearly 25 years, watching the city grow from soot-choked streets to gilded avenues where fortunes rose and vanished like stage illusions. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had faced knife fights in Five Points, fires that roared through wooden rooftops, riots that thundered like storms. But nothing unsettled him as deeply as the silence spreading through the alleys this week, a silence so absolute it felt woven from absence rather than peace. He first noticed it on a grey afternoon, when the sky hung low as a damp wool blanket. The sweetness drifted through the alleys like a rumor with no source. Brannigan paused near Baxter Street, lifting his head as the scent brushed past him, warm, cloying, too gentle to be innocent. "That again," he muttered. 2 days earlier, he had found 3 men collapsed behind a saloon, their bodies already cooling. The doctor claimed they'd succumbed to exhaustion, drink, or some unfortunate mix of both. But Brannigan had smelled the sweetness then, too. It was no scent he knew. Not liquor, not laudanum, not perfume spilled from a lady's pocket. It was something softer, stranger, lingering, long after life had fled the bodies. Today, he walked alone by choice. The younger officers refused to patrol the bend now, murmuring about cursed air and the sickness that steals breath. Brannigan mocked them in public, but in private he felt the same pressure on his lungs, the same hush in the alleys where even cats slunk by with their tails low. He turned onto an alley so narrow the walls nearly touched overhead, blocking out the afternoon light. Laundry hung limp on the lines above, unmoving despite the faint breeze. Then he saw it. A doorway left ajar. Brannigan drew a slow breath. The sweetness thickened. Inside the cramped room, a man sat slumped over a table as though asleep, but the stillness was too perfect, too complete. A cup of coffee cooled untouched at his elbow. His hand remained poised mid-reach, as if he simply forgot to finish the motion. Brannigan stepped closer. "Sir?" he called softly. No answer. He reached for the man's wrist. Cold, breathless, gone. A tremor rippled up Brannigan's spine. He had seen death countless times, but this eerie, frozen posture felt wrong. He backed away, careful not to disturb the scene. As he returned to the alley, a movement caught his eye, a boy no older than 8, watching him from behind a stack of crates. "You shouldn't be out," Brannigan said gently. The boy blinked. "Mama says the air's gone bad." Brannigan knelt. "Do you think it's gone bad?" The boy nodded, small chin trembling. "It tastes sweet." A cold knot tightened in Brannigan's stomach. "Where's your mother?" The boy pointed toward a tenement door across the alley. The inspector rose slowly, dread settling in his bones like frost. He knocked once, twice. No response. He pushed the door open. Inside, 5 people lay where morning left them, parents in their chairs. A teenage daughter still holding a half-sewn shirt, a baby curled in its cradle, face peaceful. The sweetness pressed hard against Brannigan's throat. He staggered backward into the alley, gasping. The boy watched him quietly, as though expecting this reaction. "How long have they been like that?" Brannigan whispered. "Since night," the boy said. "I tried to wake them. They didn't wake." Brannigan pressed a hand to his chest. His heartbeat thudded like a slow drum. The air felt thick enough to hold. "You come with me," he managed. "We'll find someone to help." But as he took the boy's hand, a shiver ran through him, a tremor that did not belong to fatigue or fear. The sweetness deepened. A faint dizziness washed over him. He steadied himself against the wall, forcing breath into his lungs. "Not yet," he told himself. "Not here." He escorted the boy toward the street, every step drawn through syrupy air. Halfway down the alley, Brannigan paused. The windows above him were shut tight. Curtains hung unmoving. The entire block seemed to be holding its breath. "This isn't right," he whispered. The boy looked up. "It's everywhere now." Brannigan stared at the fog pooling at the alley's mouth, glowing faintly under the street lamp's halo. He realized then that he was not walking ahead of the sweetness. He was walking inside it. And the city, every alley, every window, every room, seemed to be waiting for what came next. Evelyn Chastain had always believed that refinement offered protection. She was a daughter of New York's wealthiest lineage, a woman whose gowns were imported from Paris, whose invitations were engraved on thick cream stock, whose carriages never rolled through the city without footmen guiding the horses as though escorting royalty. Illness belonged to other neighborhoods, other families, other worlds, not hers. But refinement offers no shield when the air itself turns hostile. When whispers of the sweet sickness began drifting through opera boxes and dinner tables, Evelyn laughed delicately behind her fan. Then the Covington ball collapsed into horror. Then the Prescott parlor was sealed. Then Lavinia Pike died in a room scented with fear and perfume. And Evelyn stopped laughing. Her father fell ill next, a sudden collapse during his afternoon papers. Breath stolen without struggle. He died before the doctor arrived. The sweetness hovered over him so strongly that the servants refused to enter the study for hours. By morning, Evelyn had decided to flee. She ordered the carriage at once, packing trunks with frantic haste jewels, gloves, skirts, letters, everything she thought essential. Her mother wept quietly as the maids folded dresses at unnatural speed, all of them glancing nervously toward the closed study door where Mr. Chastain no longer breathed. "The countryside will be safer," Evelyn insisted. "Fresh air, open fields, no factories, no crowds." Her mother nodded weakly, though her eyes never left the window. The fog beyond it shimmered with an unnatural density. An hour later, Evelyn descended the marble staircase, gloved hands trembling. The sweetness had seeped through the house overnight, clinging to the drapes like humidity. She tasted it with every breath, like warm sugar that refused to melt. "Driver," she instructed as she stepped outside, "take me to the family estate in Westchester. Quickly, before the roads become crowded." The driver gave a stiff nod, but his expression betrayed unease. The moment Evelyn settled into the carriage, she exhaled a sharp, desperate sound. She longed for the countryside, where she imagined the morning sun rising over dew-covered grass, the clean scent of pine, the blessed absence of the city's strange perfume. The carriage lurched forward, but New York watched her go. The fog thickened as they crossed into the outer districts. The sweetness followed, winding through the vents, slipping beneath the carriage windows as though curious. Evelyn pulled out her handkerchief, pressing it to her face. "Close the windows?" she snapped. "They are closed, miss," the driver said uneasily. Her heart hammered. She could feel the air growing warmer. They reached the road north, a wide stretch leading toward safety. But there, at the toll gate, the carriage halted abruptly. A crowd had gathered. Dozens of families, bundles clutched in their arms, horses trembling under the tension in the air. Evelyn stared through the window, mouth falling open at the sight of men, women, and children, rich and poor alike, pressing forward, begging the toll guards to let them pass. "Why are they stopping us? Move them aside," Evelyn demanded. The driver's voice quavered. They say there's sickness upstate too." Evelyn's blood ran cold. A man at the gate shouted, "It's in Yonkers now. They smelled it before dawn." Another cried, "Turn back. The roads are closed." The toll guard fired a warning shot into the air. Evelyn flinched. The sweetness inside the carriage deepened. Her breath hitched. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She pushed open the carriage door, stepping out into the crowd, the fog curling around her skirts like grasping fingers. "Please," she pleaded to the guard. "My father just died. We must leave the city." The guard shook his head firmly. "No one passes. Orders from Albany." Evelyn swayed. "You cannot keep us here." He looked at her with a grim sympathy. "Miss, the sickness isn't staying here." She stared at him, her gloves trembling violently. The realization struck her with the weight of stone. There was nowhere safe. Not the countryside, not the city, not even her own breath. A woman nearby collapsed, her husband screaming as he tried to lift her from the ground. The sweetness rose sharply through the fog. Evelyn staggered backward. The air tightened inside her lungs. She clutched the carriage door, vision swimming. "Miss Chastain?" the driver called. But Evelyn could not answer, for the sweetness had found her even here, at the edge of her imagined salvation, and she finally understood what her wealth could not save her from. The plague had no borders, and the air belonged to no one. Bellevue Hospital had many rooms that no one wished to enter. But on that fog-heavy afternoon, Dr. Nathaniel Harrow opened a door he did not intend to and stepped directly into the heart of the plague. He had meant to go to the East Ward, where patients still clung to life with trembling fingers. His mind swam with exhaustion, his thoughts tangled with worry and sleeplessness. The hallways blurred together, every gas lamp flickered, every nurse appeared as a pale figure moving through a haze of sweetness. Harrow gripped the stair rail as he ascended, forcing himself to breathe shallowly. The sweetness grew stronger with each step. At the top of the landing, he turned left out of habit. He should have turned right. The corridor he entered was darker than the others. The lamps were dim, their flames reduced to thin slivers despite being freshly trimmed. A cold draught slid along the floorboards, low to the ground, as though the air itself was crawling. He frowned. "This isn't the East Ward," he murmured. He should have turned back. But a soft sound drifted from the far end of the hall, a faint rustle, like fabric shifting against sheets. Someone was inside. Harrow walked toward the sound, each step echoing too loudly in the unnatural stillness. He passed closed doors, their frosted windows pale as veiled eyes. The sweetness pooled around his ankles, then rose, curling toward his throat. It felt heavier here, richer, almost intentional. He reached the final door. The knob was warm. He opened it. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single lamp on a bedside table. The light flickered like breath. The curtains were drawn tightly, sealing off the outside world. A man lay in the bed, a patient he did not recognize, but it was the air that struck Harrow first. It was thick, oppressive, sweet in a way that felt almost alive. The scent clung to the man's skin, to the sheets, to the very walls. Harrow stepped inside before realizing he should not have. "Sir?" he whispered. No response. The man's eyes were partially open, staring at the ceiling with a glassy, unfocused chill. His chest rose shallowly, too shallowly. Harrow approached the bedside and froze. The patient's breath, what little remained of it, rose visibly into the air as a faint, shimmering haze, as though the sweetness had become visible, taking on a ghost-like form above him. Harrow reached for the man's wrist. His fingers brushed skin. Warm. Oddly warm. Too warm for someone so near death. He pulled back sharply. A tremor crawled through his chest. He inhaled without meaning to. The sweetness filled him. It was heavier than before, almost resinous, like breathing syrup. His vision blurred at the edges. He staggered back, gripping the bed frame. What is this? For the first time in days, true fear cracked his composure. He stumbled toward the door, but the air thickened around him, pressing him inward. The lamp hissed, his ears rang. The sweetness clung to his lungs, coating them. He gasped. Not here, he thought. Not now. He forced himself forward, shoving the door open. The hallway, air-thin and comparatively clean, rushed toward him, though it carried its own faint sweetness. He collapsed against the wall, coughing. A nurse spotted him. Dr. Harrow. She ran toward him, her eyes widening with alarm. "Doctor, are you ill?" "No," he managed, though his chest burned. "Wrong room. Don't go in there." "Which room?" He pointed weakly. The nurse paled. "Doctor, that room was sealed this morning. The patient died at dawn. No one was supposed to enter it." Harrow stared at her. Sealed. Dead. Hours ago. Yet the room had pulsed with breath. The air had been alive with sweetness. And the patient, if that was what lay in the bed, had not been cold. Harrow's pulse thundered. The sweetness still sat in his lungs like a weight. "We must burn that room," he whispered. "Seal it. Destroy the linens. Open the windows." "The board forbade window openings," the nurse said softly. Harrow closed his eyes, panic rising. Then God, the undertaker's shop on Orchard Street had always been a solemn fixture of the neighborhood, a place of hushed voices, dark drapery, and the steady craftsmanship of a man who believed that dignity was owed even to the poorest soul. Isaac Barrow, the undertaker himself, was a figure of quiet reliability. He moved like a shadow, spoke like a prayer, and carried the dead with the tenderness of someone carrying sleeping children. But in the second week of the sweetness, Barrow found himself facing a tide no human hands could manage. His day began before dawn, when the fog still lay thick on the cobblestones and the city's lamps flickered with weary determination. He opened the door of his workshop expecting, as he always did, a quiet morning of measured tasks. Instead, 3 men waited outside, their eyes hollow, their hats clutched in trembling hands. "Mr. Barrow," one whispered. "My wife. She passed in the night." Another stepped forward. "My father, too." A third swallowed hard. "I brought my brother. He's in the cart." Barrow's heart tightened. "All at once?" They nodded. Behind them, a faint sweetness drifted through the morning air. Barrow stiffened. He had smelled it many times now at doorsteps, in alleyways, clinging to blankets wrapped around still bodies. It was becoming part of the city's breath. "Bring them inside," he murmured. But the day did not stop with 3. By mid-morning, 6 more families arrived. Then 5. Then 7. His workshop, once scented with wood polish and cold stone, filled with that warm sweetness until it coated the walls, the table, his hands. Barrow's assistant, young Jacob Bell, grew pale as he struggled to follow the master's swift, silent instructions. "Sir," Jacob whispered at one point, "there's no more room." Barrow looked around at the rows of wooden boxes waiting for transport, at the cloth-covered forms resting beneath the dim glow of oil lamps, at the tools that lay untouched because death moved faster than preparation. "Then we make room," Barrow said. He opened the back door to the courtyard and felt the sweetness slip past him like a warm exhale. The bodies had to be arranged there now, covered respectfully, shielded as best they could from the elements. But soon even the courtyard filled. By the afternoon, Barrow's hands shook as he hammered the lid of another coffin. He stopped only once when he noticed a smear of sweetness clinging to his sleeve, as if the scent itself had weight. Jacob approached him hesitantly. "Sir, how long can we keep doing this?" "As long as they bring them," Barrow replied. "But what if—" A loud bang interrupted him, someone pounding on the front door. Barrow hurried to open it. A police officer stood outside, his face grey, his uniform damp with fog. "Barrow, we need your cart at the bend. Now." Barrow nodded. "How many?" The officer swallowed hard. "Dozens." Barrow hesitated not because he feared the work, but because he feared the truth he had begun to see in the officer's trembling voice. "Give me a moment," he said quietly. He stepped back inside, Jacob trailing behind. "Load the cart," Barrow said. "We're needed." Jacob stiffened. "Sir, is it safe?" Barrow paused. He thought of the sweetness that drifted ahead of every body now, the scent that clung to their clothing, entered his home, settled into his lungs. "No," he said, "but people are depending on us." Jacob nodded, eyes glassy with fear. Together they prepared the cart, lining it with cloth, steadying the lantern, fastening the reins. When they stepped outside, the fog seemed to thicken, as though aware of where they were going. Barrow climbed onto the seat. Jacob hesitated, then climbed up beside him. The horse snorted uneasily, pawing at the ground. "Easy," Barrow whispered. He flicked the reins. As the cart rolled into the street, a gust of sweetness swept over them, curling around their shoulders like a ghostly shawl. Jacob shuddered. "Sir, what if this never stops?" Barrow stared ahead, toward the bend where dawn never seemed to break and night never fully ended. "Then New York," he said softly, "will be a city of the dead." The cart disappeared into the fog, leaving the undertaker's shop behind, silent, overfilled, and heavy with the scent of a plague that did not sleep. City Hall gleamed like a marble promise beneath the pale afternoon light, its columns white as bleached bone. On an ordinary day, the building radiated a sense of civic order, the illusion that New York, despite its crowded tenements and trembling carriages and fevered streets, remained a place governed by reason. But on this day, the steps thrummed with anxious whispers. Reporters gathered like crows on a railing, pens poised. Clerks peered from windows with tight faces. The sweetness, faint at first, drifted over the assembly like an unwelcome breeze. Inside, Mayor Edwin Hargrave paced the length of his office, his boots striking the parquet with uneven urgency. He was a man of imposing stature, with silvering hair, a commanding voice, and a stubborn belief that crises bowed to authority. But in the last week, the city had begun slipping from his grasp. The ferry incident, the slum tragedy, the whispers about sealed rooms at Bellevue, and now the undertaker's report, delivered in a trembling voice. "Sir, the dead are arriving faster than we can bury them." Hargrave had swallowed hard. Inside his coat pocket was a prepared speech, one written late into the night by a committee of advisers who had insisted the city needed reassurance, not truth. "Influenza," one adviser had said. "A seasonal wave," another added. "Panic will kill more than illness," said a third. Hargrave had nodded, though his stomach roiled. He had smelled the sweetness himself crossing City Hall Park that morning. It clung to the benches, the fountain, even the pens of the reporters waiting outside. And yet here he was about to speak. The doors opened. "Mr. Mayor," said the chief secretary, "they're ready." Hargrave stepped into the corridor and walked toward the exterior platform. Every breath he drew felt heavier, warmer, sweeter. He touched the railing as he stepped outside. A hush fell over the crowd. Reporters raised their pencils like bayonets. Hargrave cleared his throat and unfolded the paper. His voice, at first, carried the practiced strength of a man determined to maintain control. "Citizens of New York," he began, "we stand amid a troubling moment. Yes, but not an unprecedented one. This city has faced illness before, and it has endured." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Hargrave continued. "Recent reports of sudden fainting spells, respiratory failures, and—" He paused, the words catching in his throat as a wave of sweetness drifted upward from the crowd. "And unfortunate fatalities have been greatly exaggerated by rumor. Our Board of Health assures us that this is a passing influenza-like ailment." Several reporters exchanged sharp glances. In the third row, Sully Hartman of the Evening Herald narrowed his eyes. Hargrave pressed on. "There is no cause for alarm. The city will remain fully open, commerce will continue, gatherings will proceed without restriction. Windows should remain closed to avoid harmful drafts." A pulse of disbelief shot through the assembly. Someone shouted, "Close the windows? Dr. Harrow says it's in the air." Hargrave flinched. Sully stepped forward. "Mr. Mayor, is it true that entire households have been found dead? That the slums lost dozens overnight?" More shouts. "What happened on the ferry? What about the Prescott Parlor? What about Mulberry Bend?" Hargrave raised a trembling hand. "These stories are being distorted by panic. We must not allow fear to spread faster than illness." A man in the crowd collapsed. It happened so quietly that only a few saw it. A thud, a muffled cry, a woman bending over him with frantic hands. But the sweetness that rose into the air in that instant swept through the assembly like a warm, invisible tide. People froze. Reporters stepped back as one, hands covering mouths. Sully stared at the fallen man, horror widening his eyes. Hargrave's voice cracked. "Someone fetch a physician." But the city did not move. Only the sweetness moved, curling upward, settling into the open space between them, breathing through the afternoon air as though it had every right to be there. For the first time, the mayor faltered, his prepared speech trembling in his hand. And then Hargrave did the worst thing he could have possibly done. He insisted nothing was wrong. "Citizens," he said, voice straining, This is unfortunate timing. Please remain calm. This is not—" His sentence dissolved into gasps as several more people staggered. The sweetness thickened. The crowd scattered. City Hall erupted into chaos, and the mayor, pale beneath the marble facade of authority, realized too late that his announcement meant to steady the city had instead sealed its fate. The air of New York was no longer listening to authority. It was listening to itself. Miss Alice Whitcomb had arrived early that morning, her boots damp with dew as she unlocked the door to Public School No. 47 on Allen Street. She was young, only 22, with a soft voice and a hopeful manner that made even the rowdiest boys sit a little straighter in their desks. Teaching, she believed, was a noble calling, especially here in the immigrant districts where children carried hunger in their pockets and dreams in their eyes. The schoolroom greeted her with its usual smells: chalk dust, ink, wet wool, yesterday's stale bread. She opened the windows just a crack, risking reprimand to let in what she hoped was fresh morning air. But the air that entered carried something else. A faint sweetness, warm, heavy, strange. She paused, hand still on the window frame. "Not again," she whispered. Rumors had reached even the schoolhouse. Children missing from class, families gone silent in the tenements. The priest from St. James found collapsed on his own doorstep. Miss Whitcomb tried not to think about it. She arranged the slates neatly on each desk, smoothed her hair, and practiced her smile. The children needed calm. By 8 o'clock they arrived in their usual scattered fashion boots scuffing, lunch pails clanging, voices bright. 28 students filled the room. A comfortingly familiar chorus of chatter echoed across the wooden floors. "Good morning, Miss Whitcomb," they chimed. She smiled warmly. "Good morning, dears. Take your seats." But even as she spoke, she noticed small signs, subtle, almost dismissible, that prickled uneasily beneath her composure. Several children rubbed at their throats. A few blinked slowly, as though the room had dimmed. Little Nora Flanagan clutched her chest and frowned. And the sweetness lingered. Miss Whitcomb cleared her throat. "Let's begin with arithmetic." The children opened their slates. Jacob Levine raised his hand. "Miss, can we open the windows more? It feels warm." Before she could answer, the door opened and Headmaster Finch stepped inside. A rigid man with silver hair and a strict adherence to rules, he glanced sharply at the cracked windows. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "I've told you windows remain closed. Drafts spread sickness." She hesitated. "Sir, the air is quite heavy this morning." "The windows," he repeated, "stay shut." He left. The sweetness thickened. Miss Whitcomb's heart pounded. She closed the windows, though every instinct screamed not to. The room dimmed slightly, as though even the sunlight hesitated to enter. She forced a bright tone. "Now then, class." A small gasp cut through the air. At the back of the room, Henry Walsh, a quiet boy, always polite, always pale, leaned forward on his desk, breath shallow. His slate slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly on the floor. "Henry?" Miss Whitcomb hurried toward him. He coughed once, a sound dry and hollow, then pressed a trembling hand to his chest. I can't." He collapsed. The class screamed. Miss Whitcomb knelt beside him, shaking fingers searching for a pulse. She found one, but it fluttered like a trapped moth. "Stay calm," she whispered, though her voice cracked. But calm evaporated. Another child swayed. Then another. Two clutched their throats. One slid out of her chair entirely. The sweetness surged violently, a warm, almost suffocating wave. Miss Whitcomb stumbled to her feet and shouted, "Children, outside, quickly!" But the door felt impossibly far. The air grew syrup-thick. Several students staggered before they could stand. Desks toppled. Chalk rolled across the floor. The sweetness roared silently. Miss Whitcomb grabbed Nora by the wrist. "Run!" She dragged her toward the door, fighting the dizziness clawing at her vision. Other children followed, stumbling, crying, gasping. She flung the door open. The hallway air was clearer. Not safe, but clearer. She pushed the children out, urging them toward the courtyard. "Go, find air, find space." Some made it. Some collapsed halfway. Headmaster Finch appeared at the far end of the hall, face contorted with confusion and rising fear. "What is happening?" Miss Whitcomb could only whisper the truth she had refused to speak aloud. "It's the air." Finch's eyes widened. Behind her, the schoolroom darkened as if a shadow had fallen across it. The sweetness seeped into the hall, crawling after them with dreadful patience. "Close the doors!" Finch shouted. Miss Whitcomb slammed the classroom door shut, though she knew it would do nothing. Outside, in the courtyard, the children who had escaped huddled together, trembling. Some cried, some stared blankly, some breathed as though each inhale might betray them. Miss Whitcomb collapsed to her knees, chest aching, lungs burning. She looked up at the schoolhouse windows. No movement inside. No sound. Just sweetness, curling against the glass like a hand pressed from the other side. The schoolroom had emptied in minutes, not because the bell rang, not because lessons ended, but because the air itself demanded it. And Miss Whitcomb, trembling in the weak morning light, understood with shattering clarity. There was no place left in New York where children or anyone could breathe safely. The granite pillars of the Merchants and Exchange Bank on Wall Street had always stood as symbols of certainty, cold, immovable, unshaken by rumor, riot, or recession. Money, after all, was the heartbeat of the Gilded Age. Fortune could be lost and rebuilt, markets could swell and collapse, but the vault beneath the bank never changed. It was sanctuary, fortress, and temple, all at once. That belief kept Henry Calder calm long after most of New York had begun to tremble. Calder, senior banker and austere custodian of the vault, believed in figures, not feelings. He trusted balance sheets, not superstitions. Even as whispers of the sweet plague crept into the parlors of his wealthiest clients, he reminded them with cool authority. "Panic," he would say, "ruins more men than illness." But that was before the board's missteps, before the undertaker's grim news, before the incident at City Hall, which Calder had witnessed from a distance, the mayor insisting all was well as bodies crumpled like wilted flowers. And now, as he walked into the bank at just past 7 in the morning, he smelled it. The sweetness. It lingered in the marble foyer, faint but unmistakable, like candied fruit left too long in a warm drawer. Calder's jaw tightened. He approached the teller desks. They sat empty, though 2 clerks should have been arranging ledgers by now. A half-packed satchel lay abandoned behind the counter. "Thomas?" he called. Silence. He continued down the hallway, his footsteps echoing sharply across marble. The lamps burned low, their flames trembling. He passed the boardroom chairs scattered, a ledger on the floor before reaching the bank's administrative offices. He pushed open the door to the manager's office. Manager O'Neill sat slumped in his chair, spectacles crooked, pen fallen from his fingers. He looked as though he'd dozed mid-sentence. Calder swallowed hard. "Michael." He took a step closer. The sweetness pooled in the room like warm breath. O'Neill did not stir. Calder pressed 2 fingers to the man's throat. No pulse. He stumbled back, hand trembling. His rational mind clawed for explanation, exhaustion, heart attack, anything ordinary. But the scent told him otherwise. He hurried out, almost running now, toward the staircase leading down to the vault. His sanctuary, the one place where New York could not intrude. The air grew cooler as he descended, stone walls swallowing the sweetness. He fumbled with the keys, breath unsteady, until the vault door loomed before him, a steel monolith with gears thick as wagon wheels. He unlocked the first mechanism, then the second. Finally, the great wheel turned, groaning open. Inside, the vault felt pure, cold, still, metallic. Everything the world above was not. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him, not fully at first, merely to create a barrier. His lungs felt clearer. His mind steadied. He paced between the stacks of safety boxes and crates of bonds, whispering to himself, "It cannot reach here. It cannot." But something gnawed at him. If he stayed here, what of his clerks? What of the customers queuing outside every morning? What of the wives of the men who trusted him with generational wealth? He should go back up. He knew it. Yet part of him whispered, "Stay. Stay where the sweetness cannot find you." Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, uneven. Above him. He froze. The vault walls were thick, but the staircase channeled sound like a funnel. Another step. And another. Something or someone was descending. Calder's breath quickened. "Thomas?" he called upward, voice cracking. "Is that you?" No answer. The footsteps grew louder. He stepped back, heart pounding against his ribs. "Michael?" he whispered, though he knew the manager's body was still upstairs. The sweetness drifted down the stairwell, sliding into the vault like a warm ribbon, heavier than before, clinging to the cold air. Calder slammed the vault door shut. The wheel spun. The metal sealed. Darkness enclosed him with suffocating immediacy. He stood alone in the silence, chest rising and falling, the sweetness cut off for now. Safe. For the first time in his career, Henry Calder clutched the vault door not like a guardian, but like a frightened man holding fast to the last illusion of safety. But as the gas lamps flickered inside the sealed chamber, their light somehow dim. Despite the lack of draft, he realized the truth. He had refused to speak aloud. The vault was not sanctuary. It was a tomb waiting for a body, and Calder had just locked himself inside. The charity ward at Bellevue Hospital had long been a place of quiet despair, where the poorest of New York were gathered under the flickering lamplight, their breaths shallow, their voices muted by the exhaustion of want. Here, illness was always a visitor, sometimes polite, sometimes rude, but always expected. The ward's corridors smelled of boiled potatoes, disinfectant, and unwashed linen, a cocktail familiar to both patients and nurses alike. But now a new presence had entered, a sweetness so thick and insistent that it clung to the walls, the floorboards, and the very air, pressing into the lungs of anyone who inhaled too deeply. Nurse Margaret Hale had arrived before dawn, weary but determined. The previous night had offered no rest. The night before that had offered none. Yet even she had not expected the sight awaiting her in the ward that morning. The doors had barely opened when she glimpsed the first wave of arrivals. 2 stretchers, carried by grim-faced orderlies, creaked beneath the weight of bodies already cold, eyes half-lidded, lips tinged with unnatural warmth. They were soon followed by another, then another, until the hallway outside was packed with the sick, their friends and relatives hovering desperately, some coughing, some whispering of the sweetness that had already invaded the tenements and streets. Margaret drew a deep breath, forcing calm. "Set them on the floor if necessary," she instructed the orderlies. "We will make space." Space, a word that had once carried promise, now hollow and distant. She moved from stretcher to stretcher, adjusting pillows, lifting blankets, whispering reassurances she did not feel. The sweetness was everywhere, draped over the bodies, hovering in the corners, lingering in the folds of her uniform. It clung to her hands even after they had been scrubbed raw, and to her mask, no matter how tightly it was pressed against her face. Dr. Harrow arrived in the middle of the surge, tall and grim, already anticipating the chaos. He moved quickly, placing hands on foreheads, pressing stethoscopes to chests, murmuring observations he dared not voice aloud. Each patient followed the same terrifying pattern. Sudden breathlessness, warmth rising without fever, collapse within minutes, and above all, the unmistakable sweetness, thick and almost sentient. By mid-morning, the ward had outgrown itself. Beds overflowed into the hallways, stretchers were stacked too deep in corners, and patients who could stand leaned against walls for support. The sound of groaning and coughing formed a low, constant hum, punctuated by the occasional shriek or whisper. Margaret worked tirelessly, directing aides, calming children, holding hands, guiding the partially conscious. She was a beacon of steadiness in the fevered chaos, yet even she could feel the pull of exhaustion pressing against her spine. A young mother arrived with her infant, her expression vacant, eyes red from tears and fear. She had walked for hours from the Lower East Side. The baby's small chest rose and fell weakly. Margaret took the child into her arms, inhaling the sweet, warm scent that clung to its tiny clothing. She felt it settle over her like a cloak, oppressive and invasive. She whispered a prayer, though she had long stopped believing they could alter the course of events. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, the city indifferent to the suffering within. Carriages clattered, market cries drifted faintly, yet the ward was a separate world, suspended in time and air thickened with sweetness. Orders from the Board of Health had not yet arrived. Even if they had, opening the windows was forbidden. The patients were trapped in both the ward and the city's inaction. By noon, Margaret paused for a single, fleeting moment, resting her hands on a bedpost, her face damp with sweat and tears. She counted the stretchers and beds, realized there were not enough for everyone already here, and knew more would arrive soon. Her throat ached from constant whispering. Her lungs burned from the warmth in the air. Yet she continued, because if she did not, no one else would. The charity ward had burst at the seams, overflowing with the city's poor, its frightened, its doomed. And the sweetness, relentless, merciless, omnipresent, settled over the room like a shroud, promising that New York's suffering was only beginning. Margaret Hale, exhausted but resolute, whispered to herself, we hold them, at least, until the air claims us all." The streets of New York had grown quieter in ways that were unnatural. Even at noon, when the sun threatened to pierce the fog with its pale light, the clatter of carriage wheels and the hum of pedestrians seemed subdued, reluctant, hesitant. Policemen who had patrolled the city for decades, men accustomed to brawls, theft, fires, and worse, now walked with eyes lowered, boots scraping against cobblestones, hands hovering near the holster not for protection but for reassurance. Sergeant Daniel Hayes, stationed in the Lower East Side, felt it immediately upon stepping from the precinct. The usual smell of horse dung and coal smoke was present, but beneath it lay something else, something unfamiliar, warm and clinging, a sweetness that draped over the street like a shroud. Hayes drew in a breath and felt the weight of it pressing into his chest. His pulse quickened. He had heard whispers during the morning roll call, reports of collapses in alleyways, sudden sickness at the markets, fainting children in the schoolrooms. Officers across the city had begun to avoid the densest pockets of the population, claiming illness, family duties, or overwork. Hayes had been skeptical. Duty was duty. But when he passed the corner of Hester and Baxter, he saw it with his own eyes. A man, middle-aged, slumped against the wall of a tenement, unmoving, eyes half-lidded, lips tinged with unnatural warmth. A boy sat a few feet away, hands pressed to his face in terror. Hayes stepped closer, but the sweetness seemed to rise like a fog, curling around him, nudging him backward. The alley was still, as though the city itself had hushed to watch. He drew back, suddenly aware of his own shallow breaths. He looked around. Other officers stood farther down the street, hesitating, eyes averted, boots scraping cobblestones nervously. No one moved forward. No one helped. By mid-morning, the phenomenon repeated in other streets. A woman collapsed outside the bakery. A young man fell leaving a factory. A child crumpled against the railing of a bridge. Hayes could feel the unease spreading, a contagion of fear as real as the illness itself. The sweetness hovered over each scene, undeterred by distance, indifferent to uniforms. A captain approached him near the river, face pale beneath the brim of his hat. "Daniel, I've told the men don't approach. They're saying it's in the air. We can't touch them." Hayes shook his head. "We can't just leave them." The captain looked away. "Orders are orders. Some things are beyond even the law." And indeed, they were. Hayes had learned that the law, the authority of the city, the police who prided themselves on controlling the streets, meant nothing against this invisible intruder. Officers stepped over bodies as though they were obstacles in the street rather than human beings. Eyes that had once held certainty now reflected hesitation, fear, and the first hints of despair. Hayes passed a group of men on Bowery, all policemen, gathered around a body partially covered with a threadbare coat. One nudged the corpse with a boot, then glanced at Hayes and muttered, "It's nothing. Keep walking." Another looked at him, face pale, and nodded silently. No one would help. No one could. The sweetness rose between the officers like a river of warmth, winding through their collars, wrapping itself around wrists, settling against their lungs. It made the air feel heavy, impossible to navigate. It forced them to hesitate, to avert their eyes, to look away. Hayes pressed a hand to his chest, struggling to breathe, to steady himself. He knew in that instant, that the city's authority had been broken. The streets no longer belonged to men, to law, to order. The streets belonged to the illness, to the sweetness, to the unseen hand that walked alongside death. He walked on, heart hammering. Each alley seemed to pulse with the same invisible menace, and all around him the policemen looked away. Some averted their eyes out of fear, some out of despair, and some out of a recognition they did not dare speak aloud. There was nothing they could do. The streets were no longer safe, and the men sworn to protect them could only watch. The theaters of Broadway had always been the crown jewel of New York's glittering society, where velvet curtains hid the laboring machinery of illusions, and gas lamps cast a warm glow upon audiences eager for laughter, drama, and escape. On any ordinary evening, the streets thrummed with life. Carriages clattering, vendors calling, actors and actresses rushing through alleyways in sequined garments and powdered faces. But the sweetness, the warm, cloying, insidious sweetness had arrived here as well, and the applause had fled. Miss Clara Whitford, leading lady of the Morning Star Theatre, had first noticed it during rehearsal. She stood beneath the proscenium arch, adjusting the hem of her gown, and inhaled the air. There it was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, yet unmistakable. Sweet, warm, heavy, pressing against her chest like a hand she could not brush away. The scent lingered in her lungs, stuck to her voice, and she shivered. The actors tried to carry on, but the usual vitality had gone. The pianist's fingers trembled over the keys. The chorus sang flat. Stagehands moved in silence, glancing nervously toward the dressing rooms. The air in the theatre seemed alive, holding the sound at bay, diluting it until the laughter and music felt fragile, like soap bubbles ready to burst. By evening, the audience arrived. Wealthy patrons in carriages, dresses rustling, gloves clutched tightly, hats cocked just so. They entered with the expectation of entertainment, of relief from the city's growing tension. But as they crossed the threshold, the sweetness greeted them, subtle at first, then unmistakable. It curled around their collars, pressed against their cheeks, brushed their throats. Conversation slowed, smiles froze, applause became a memory that hovered just beyond reach. A child seated in the front row tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, it smells funny," she whispered. The mother glanced around nervously, lips pressed tight. "It's nothing, dear," she said, though her own voice betrayed doubt. Even here, within the polished walls of society's pleasure palace, the invisible menace had arrived. Miss Whitford stepped onto the stage for the opening scene. Her heart pounded. She tried to project confidence, to summon the drama that had earned her fame, but the sweetness thickened around her, pressing against her lungs, making every breath a labor. She saw the audience shift uneasily in their seats, some coughing, some fanning themselves, some leaning forward with wide eyes. Their attention was no longer on the performance. Their attention was on the air itself. During the first act, 3 patrons fainted. 2 fell in the aisles. 1 slumped silently at his seat. Ushers moved among them with uncertain steps, but the air pressed down so heavily that even moving bodies seemed slowed, weighed, and reluctant. A murmur ran through the theatre like a slow ripple of water. Gas lamps flickered. Curtains seemed heavier, almost as if absorbing the dread that had settled. By the second act, the musicians had ceased entirely, their instruments abandoned on the orchestra pit. Miss Whitford's voice echoed hollowly against the walls, unanswered, and she realized with a cold certainty that the theatre, her world, her stage, her sanctuary, had been claimed by the city's invisible visitor. When the final curtain fell, there was no applause, only a silence that felt heavier than the velvet drapes, a silence that filled the theatre with a tangible weight. Patrons filed out quietly, hesitant, eyes flicking to every shadow, to every corner, as though the very walls might exhale the sweetness and claim them next. Miss Whitford lingered on the stage, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the empty seats. She could still smell it, the warmth clinging to her hair and gown. The audience had gone, but the city's presence had remained, filling the theater with its soft, oppressive perfume. Broadway, once the city's heart of joy and applause, now throbbed with a new rhythm, the rhythm of fear, of absence, of quiet surrender. The applause was gone, the laughter was gone, and in its place rose the sweetness, patient, unyielding, waiting. The East River, usually alive with the clatter of barges and the low hum of ferry engines, seemed to hold its breath. Mist curled over the water like a shroud, muffling sound, hiding the sharp outlines of warehouses and wharves. On ordinary mornings, the docks would teem with activity, dock hands shouting, horses stamping, cargo being hoisted and lowered. But today, the river carried something heavier than goods or timber. It carried bodies. Captain Matthias Leary had been navigating the barges for over 20 years, hauling coal, timber, and the occasional shipment of goods across the harbor. He had seen death on the streets, in tenements, in the alleyways behind factories, but he had never seen it move so swiftly, so indiscriminately, as it had over the past week. And now it traveled the water. The first barge arrived at the municipal landing just past sunrise. Its deck was crowded with unclaimed bodies, each swaddled in coarse blankets, each still warm, the faint scent of sweetness rising from them like a vapor that clung to the hull. Dockworkers recoiled instinctively, their faces pale beneath caps, hands pressing to noses and mouths. Leary directed the crew in hushed, urgent tones. "Keep them covered. Keep them still." A laborer whispered almost to himself, "They're too many, even for the river." Leary ignored him. He had been trained to follow orders, to move what needed moving without hesitation. But even he felt the oppressive weight of the air, the warmth of the sweetness that settled across the deck like molten honey. It pressed into his chest, thickening each breath. By noon, 4 more barges had been guided in, each carrying its grim cargo. Bodies from the Lower East Side, bodies from Mulberry Bend, bodies from alleys too narrow to count, streets too crowded to navigate. And all of them bore the signature of the plague-pallid skin, shallow breaths, and the pervasive sweetness that seemed almost to pulse above their heads. Dock workers worked quickly but cautiously, laying the bodies onto prepared carts and stretchers. Their movements were deliberate, almost reverent, yet the air clung, seeping through gloves, twisting around boots, brushing against the skin like invisible fingers. Even the horses used to haul the carts refused to move briskly, snorting and stamping nervously. Captain Leary paced the length of the pier. He had delivered coal, timber, and grain in his life. He had guided ferries through fogs thick enough to blind a man. He had seen riots and fires, the city swallowing itself in smoke and fear. But the sight of these barges, silent, slow, and insistent, filled him with an unease deeper than any storm or mob. From the warehouses lining the pier, a faint cry rose, a mother discovering that her child would never return. The sweetness rode the sound, carrying grief along with it. Leary swallowed hard. He glanced at the water. The barges rocked gently, rising and falling as though the river itself were mourning. The mist hid the edges of the docks, hiding the city behind a grey curtain. And yet the air above the water was alive with movement, the subtle, omnipresent touch of the sweetness. Leary barked orders, moving his men from one deck to another. Carts were loaded, bodies were transferred. Still, he felt the pressing weight of inevitability. For every barge he guided in, another seemed ready to follow, floating silently through the fog, carrying more of the city's dead. By evening, the dockyards stank faintly of the river, wet wood, and the lingering perfume of the plague. Captain Leary stood at the pier's edge, watching the barges drift slowly into the harbor, mist curling around them like smoke. The East River, lifeline of New York, had become a conveyor of the dead. The sweetness, ever present, rose from the decks and mingled with the fog, weaving itself through the city as it had through the streets, the alleys, and the hospitals. Leary inhaled it once, sharp and oppressive, and understood fully no bridge, no dock, no riverbank would remain untouched. The city's heartbeat had slowed, and the river carried its pulse, sweet, invisible, and relentless. The barges of the dead would continue their silent procession, and the river, patient and indifferent, would deliver them to every corner of the city. The chemist's shop on Grand Street had once been a place of quiet certainty. Shelves lined with amber bottles and glass vials reflected the morning sun through dusty windows. Labels, printed in precise serif lettering, promised remedies for coughs, colds, fever, and the faintest unease. Customers trusted in Dr. Benjamin Lorimer and his concoctions, believing in the careful blending of herbs and compounds, the precision of his measurements, the authority of his hand, but the sweetness had reached even here. It drifted under the door and curled along the shelves, clinging to the bottles like a living thing. Lorimer inhaled it instinctively as he arranged tinctures, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. Something was different, not the ordinary odors of the city, nor the faint tang of ammonia or alcohol, nor even the earthy perfume of dried roots and powders. This was warmer, heavier, almost expectant. It pressed against his chest, entering his lungs with a subtle insistence that made him pause. The first customer arrived, a middle-aged man with a pale face and a tremor in his hands. He clutched a letter from a neighbor, whispered about a cough in the street, a faint sweetness rising from the alley outside. "Something for your husband?" Lorimer asked. The man nodded, voice hoarse. "He cannot breathe properly. The doctor at Bellevue said I should come here." Lorimer fetched a small bottle, filled it with a dark liquid, and handed it over. "By the drop," he instructed. "One in water, thrice daily. It should ease his lungs, keep the fever at bay." The man left quickly, bottle clutched tightly, but Lorimer noticed the subtle way the sweetness seemed to drift behind him, curling around his coat, as if testing the boundaries of its reach. By midday, the shop was crowded. Neighbors, tenement dwellers, shopkeepers, even a few cautious gentlemen from wealthier districts pressed forward, clutching letters, newspaper clippings, and whispered warnings. Each inhaled the air and recoiled at the faint sweetness that lingered like invisible mist. Lorimer moved among them, measuring, mixing, advising, his hands shaking despite the practiced precision he had maintained for years. "Doctor," one woman said, voice quivering, "will this truly protect him?" Lorimer paused, feeling the weight of the air settle heavier around his shoulders. I believe it may help with symptoms," he said cautiously, "but it cannot control the air itself." A hush fell over the room as several customers caught the drift of the sweetness more strongly than usual. They looked around at each other, realization creeping slowly across their faces. A young boy in the corner coughed once, then leaned over the counter, staring wide-eyed at the amber bottles. Lorimer's own pulse quickened. He had spent years measuring, calculating, weighing, testing, yet the air itself had become a variable he could not control. No drop, no tincture, no preparation could touch it, and still the customers pressed forward, desperate, hoping that salvation might be bottled. By late afternoon, the line had grown out onto the street. Pedestrians stepped carefully, avoiding those who faltered along the sidewalk or who inhaled too deeply and collapsed mid-step. A man carrying a crate of medicines stumbled, and the sweetness rose in a wave around him, sticky and insistent. Lorimer rushed out to help, feeling it curl into his chest and lungs as he lifted the fallen man. He understood, then, with sharp clarity, that his remedies, all the careful, measured drops he could offer, were no more than comfort. The sweetness, the sickness, the city itself, these were forces beyond human calculation, moving through air, bodies, and alleys alike. By evening, Lorimer sat behind his counter, bottles arrayed neatly before him, yet every inhale brought the warmth of the sweetness deeper into his lungs. The customers had gone, carrying their doses and hopes into the night, leaving the shop empty, but for the lingering presence that would not leave. Dr. Lorimer realized, at last, that he was not selling salvation. He was selling a pause, a fragile illusion, against a tide that could not be measured, could not be contained, and would not wait. The sweetness rose around him, and he breathed it in, knowing he too would be counted among the city's fragile defenses, powerless, human, and utterly exposed. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow had known exhaustion, certainly, but the hours he spent in the wards last night felt unlike anything he had endured. The gas lamps burned low, their flames flickering against the walls as though they too shivered with the city's dread. Outside, the streets were silent, except for the occasional creak of a distant carriage or the faint murmur of voices that never seemed to belong to anyone alive. Within the hospital, the sweetness lingered like a living fog, curling around beds, weaving between the legs of chairs, pressing upon lungs with soft insistence. Harrow moved from patient to patient with mechanical precision, though his heart pounded with the knowledge that precision could not save them. The air was thick, warm, and sweet, not like flowers, not like sugar, not like medicine, but like a quiet force settling into every corner of the ward, leaving no space untouched. By midnight, the wards had begun to overflow. Patients lay in every available bed, on stretchers in the hallways, propped against walls and rails. The nurses, trembling but resolute, moved tirelessly, guiding the living and tending the fading. Margaret Hale stayed by Harrow's side, whispering words of comfort to the sick and the dying alike. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook from fatigue, and her eyes glimmered with unshed tears. Harrow paused by a young boy from Mulberry Bend, a child whose chest rose and fell in shallow, uncertain rhythms. The sweetness hovered thickly above him, a palpable presence in the dim lamplight. Harrow pressed a stethoscope to the boy's chest. He felt the fluttering, uneven, almost hesitant heartbeat, a fragile resistance against the inevitability that surrounded them. Hours passed in a blur. The air seemed to pulse with each intake and exhale, rising with every shallow gasp of the patients. Harrow had begun to lose sense of time. The wards stretched infinitely, populated by the living and the not quite living alike. The lamps trembled as if they feared the darkness beyond, and the shadows on the walls danced like phantoms in rhythm with the sweet, pervasive odor that had claimed the city. A wagon arrived silently at the side entrance. Orderlies carried bodies covered in coarse blankets. Harrow guided them into the morgue with the precision of a man who could no longer afford emotion. Each arrival felt like an indictment. Another life claimed, another piece of the city surrendered. At 2 a.m, a faint sound echoed down the hallway, a cough, then another. Harrow moved toward it instinctively, finding a young woman who had collapsed in a corner. Her eyes flickered, wide and frightened, as if she could see the sweetness itself. He lifted her gently, laying her on a vacant bed. She grasped his hand. "Will I live?" she whispered. Harrow shook his head slightly, not wanting to speak the truth. "We'll try," he murmured. By 4 o'clock, exhaustion threatened to overtake him. Every muscle ached. Every step felt weighted by the knowledge of those he could not save. Yet, he could not leave. Not while the wards still held breath, however shallow, however fleeting. Outside, the dawn began to stir. Pale light filtered weakly through the high windows, touching the edges of the ward. Harrow paused, leaning heavily against a bedpost, and allowed himself a single, shallow breath. The sweetness remained, faintly clinging to the air, reminding him that the city had not yet released its hold. Nurses whispered encouragement, shifted blankets, and tended the unrelenting tide of illness. Harrow glanced at Margaret Hale, her eyes heavy, her hands still steady, and knew that leaving now would mean abandoning them all. So he stayed. Until dawn. He stayed through the endless night, moving among the sick and dying, inhaling the thick, cloying sweetness that had claimed New York, and carrying on with a grim determination that defied the inevitability around him. And as the first real light of morning touched the ward, he realized something that had become painfully clear over the last 8 hours. He was not merely tending the living. He was standing sentinel over the city itself, a fragile bulwark against the unseen, merciless air that had begun to write its own history upon the hearts and lungs of New York. The streets of New York were cloaked in a thick, lazy fog, softening the sharp angles of the city into smudges of stone and brick. Gas lamps burned weakly along the avenues, casting trembling halos over cobblestones slick with damp and soot. Inside the office of Dr. Nathaniel Harrow, the air was heavier still, saturated with the lingering sweetness that had become the city's invisible companion. Harrow's pen hovered over parchment, his hand shaking despite years of disciplined training, despite nights spent among the dying and the despairing. He wrote not to comfort, not to advise, but to plead, to Washington, to some distant authority he hoped could comprehend the unfolding horror, though he suspected they could not. The letter began simply, formally, in the voice of a man attempting order where none existed. To the Honorable Secretary of Health, Washington, D. I write to you with the gravest concern for the city of New York. An unusual and deadly phenomenon has emerged in multiple districts. Its speed, subtlety, and lethality surpass known illnesses. Patients collapse suddenly, their breath shallow, their skin warm, their deaths often occurring before intervention is possible. The condition spreads rapidly, without regard for social standing, age, or location. It is airborne. Harrow paused, dipping his pen in ink, staring at the half-finished lines. Even describing it in words seemed insufficient. The sweetness, its warmth, its cloying insistence pressed into his lungs as he wrote, as though the air itself was reading over his shoulder. He continued, I have attached a detailed report of observations, including locations of collapse, patient symptoms, and suspected vectors. The usual measures, including quarantine and increased ventilation, are inadequate. I implore your immediate intervention. Without action, New York may soon fall victim to a crisis beyond any precedent. Outside, the city murmured with its ordinary activity. Carriages rattled over wet stones. Market cries echoed faintly. But the air itself was different, thick with the sweetness, curling around the lampposts, pressing into alleys and tenements alike. Harrow could smell it even through the closed windows, drifting faintly like a predatory fog. He sealed the envelope with careful precision, but even as he pressed the wax seal, he knew, as he had known for days, that distance would not protect the city. Letters could not contain the air. Authority could not command it, and yet he had to try. Harrow summoned a courier, a young man from the Herald he trusted to navigate the streets without pause. Take this to the post office immediately, he instructed. Do not linger. Do not let the weather, the fog, or the street slow you. It is urgent. Lives depend upon it. The courier hesitated, sniffing the air. The sweetness curled around his collar, warm and almost inviting. Are you certain this will help? Harrow's eyes were hard. It is all we can do. Nothing else works. The boy nodded and left, the letter clutched tightly in his gloved hands, disappearing into the grey streets. Harrow returned to the window, leaning heavily against the sill. From below, he could see the city continuing its day, oblivious, indifferent, each citizen inhaling the very force that had begun to claim their lives. Even as he watched, he saw a man collapse into the street, a child clutch his throat, a woman drop to her knees in sudden weakness. The sweetness hovered above them, patient, deliberate, invisible. He whispered to himself, voice hollow. Perhaps they will understand. Perhaps someone far away can act where we cannot. But he knew the letter could only plead. It could not save. The air pressed closer to the window pane, swirling in faint, warm currents. Harrow inhaled and shivered. The city waited, and so did the sweetness. Washington would receive the letter, and New York would continue to breathe its peril. The city had been quiet, deceptively quiet, all day. Shops had opened, streetcars had rumbled, and the occasional clatter of a horse's hooves echoed across the cobblestones. Yet an unnatural hush pressed over Manhattan. It was the kind of silence that makes the familiar streets appear foreign, the kind that makes gas lamps tremble even in the absence of wind. By nightfall, the fog thickened into a living thing, clinging to doorways, curling around corners, pressing into the lungs of anyone who dared to step outside. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow stood at the top of the stairs of Bellevue, surveying the wards below. The air within was suffocating with its thick, cloying sweetness, a perfume of death and inevitability. He had walked the halls for nights unbroken, tending the living and watching the dead, inhaling the city's new breath, feeling it press upon his chest with every step. Each patient, each fainting child, each body delivered by the undertakers reminded him that the city was slipping beyond control. Outside the hospital, the streets were filled with muted chaos. Families huddled together, clutching children and bundles, trying to understand why neighbors had disappeared overnight, why alleys that once bustled with trade now lay quiet. Word had spread quickly, whispers, rumors, frightened murmurs, yet no one dared speak the word aloud. Until tonight. The first faint acknowledgement came from Mulberry Bend, where a widow screamed for her lost children. From tenements along Baxter and Hester, cries rose, neighbors calling each other's names, bodies pressed to walls, eyes searching for anyone alive. In the schoolrooms, empty now, chairs rattled in the wind that carried the warmth of the sweetness. In the wealthy districts, parlors once filled with polite chatter now smelled faintly of fear. Perfume mingled with a heavier, stranger odor, and still no one said it. Harrow descended the stairwell into the ward, moving among stretchers, beds, and mats crowded into corners. Nurses whispered prayers as they tended the feverish, the fainting, the dying. Margaret Hale stood near the center, her hands shaking, eyes red but steady. "They are asking the word doctor," she said softly. Harrow understood immediately. They needed to name the invisible, to give shape to the intangible horror that had seized the city. He stepped to the nearest open window, lifting his voice over the low moan of the wind and the faint, ever-present creak of the building. "Plague!" he shouted, and the word fell like a hammer through the air. It carried, strangely, farther than he expected. From tenements to warehouses, from parlors to alleyways, the city absorbed it. The fog seemed to shiver. Lamps flickered. Somewhere, a horse neighed in terror. Mothers clutched their children closer. Men froze mid-step, eyes wide with understanding and fear. "Plague," repeated a child on the streets below. "Plague," echoed a man leaning against a lamppost. "Plague," whispered an undertaker lifting a body from a barge. The sweetness thickened, responding, almost triumphant. It swirled through the alleyways, the wards, the parlor rooms of the wealthy, brushing against faces, slipping into hair, threading through lungs. The city inhaled it collectively, understanding what had been whispered only in private for days. Harrow walked among his patients, raising his voice again. "Plague! New York, hear me! This is what has taken your neighbors, your children, your friends." The word rippled through the streets like a tide. Some fainted, some screamed, some finally understood. And in that moment, New York no longer hid behind the pretense of order. The air pressed heavier, almost sentient, as if acknowledging the city's confession. The sweetness, pervasive and merciless, moved unchecked through streets, alleys, hospitals, and homes. For the first time, the people named the horror they could not see, could not fight, could not escape. And as they whispered it from mouth to mouth, the city itself shivered, caught in a truth it had long resisted. The plague had arrived, patient, pervasive, and unstoppable. And in the quiet of the fog, as gas lamps trembled and church bells tolled faintly in the distance, New York finally spoke. Plague. The city had named its shadow. By the time the sun rose weakly over the city's grimy skyline, Bellevue Hospital had become a monument to mortality. Beds overflowed into every corridor, stretchers lined every hallway, and corners were stacked with bodies awaiting attendants who could scarcely keep up. The ward, once a place of measured efficiency, now resembled a cathedral of suffering, every space crowded with the sick and dying, every surface pressed by the warmth and weight of the sweetness that hung invisibly in the air. Nurse Margaret Hale moved among the rows of white sheets with relentless precision. Each bed was a world unto itself, a fragile life tucked beneath linen, sometimes quivering, sometimes still. Her hands, scraped and raw from hours of tending, pressed against foreheads and chests, measuring temperature, checking pulse, whispering reassurances she could no longer believe. Yet even her faith could not dispel the oppression that had gathered in the air like a tangible cloak. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow paced the ward, chest tight, vision blurred with exhaustion. He had witnessed death countless times, yet the sight before him was unlike any he had known. Rows of sheets flanked the hallways like the tide of a merciless sea. Each body beneath them was anonymous, yet unmistakably human. The faint scent of the sweetness lingered over every one, pressing against him as though reminding him that no hand, no medicine, no will could halt its quiet dominion. A stretcher arrived at the side door, bearing a man from Mulberry Bend. The attendants lowered him gently onto the nearest available bed. He was pale, chest rising, and falling in uneven flutters. Harrow leaned over, checking pulse and breath, feeling the ineffable weight of the air press into his lungs. "This is not influenza," Harrow murmured, mostly to himself. "It moves too quickly, spreads too indiscriminately, and leaves no pattern." Margaret nodded without looking up. She was attending to a child beside them, one small figure who trembled under the force of the sweetness, clutching a damp blanket to his chest. Her voice was calm, soft, steady, a fragile beacon in the relentless tide. Outside the windows, the fog pressed against the panes, indistinct and watchful. Carriages moved sluggishly along the streets, horses snorting nervously, as if aware of the invisible hand that now guided the city. The sound of footsteps and distant voices was muted, as though swallowed by the dense, sweet air that pervaded every block. Harrow stopped by another bed, a young woman with eyes wide and unfocused. She reached for him, whispering something unintelligible. Her words dissolved in the heavy air, carried off by the scent that clung to her like a second skin. He pressed a cool hand to her forehead, feeling the faint tremor that betrayed life still flickering beneath the warmth of her body. The hospital had become a labyrinth of humanity and mortality, each corridor a river of white sheets and anxious, exhausted attendants. Patients arrived faster than they could be tended. Orders from the board forbade opening windows, citing drafts and propriety, but the sweetness pressed inside anyway, weaving through corridors, pooling in corners, thickening the air with its invisible presence. Margaret adjusted a pillow for a man who moaned softly beneath his sheet. She whispered, "We hold them for now," and her words carried more truth than reassurance. Harrow paused beside her, glancing down the length of the ward. Each bed was a testament to lives claimed or threatened. Each sheet, white and untouched, glimmered faintly in the lamplight like feathers, fragile and fleeting. By midday, the hospital had become a cathedral of survival and despair, a place where the sweetness, patient, pervasive, unrelenting, held dominion over all who breathed. Outside, the city continued its indifferent pulse, but inside, Every step, every breath, every whispered word carried the weight of inevitability. And so the hospital remained, feathered in white sheets, a sanctuary of labor, loss, and lingering sweetness, waiting for the next tide of bodies that would arrive with the dusk, the night, and the merciless advance of the plague. Isaac Barrow had built his life upon precision, routine, and the solemn dignity of his craft. For decades, his workshop had been a sanctuary where grief could be honored, where wood and nails and wax met the inevitability of death with respectful ceremony. But in the last week, the cadence of his work had been disrupted. The city itself seemed to have accelerated its pace of mortality, sending him more bodies than he could bury, more despair than he could carry. And today the truth struck him like the hammer on a coffin lid. He had run out of wood. The morning began with a delivery that had been expected 3 bodies from Bellevue, carefully wrapped in coarse blankets, tenderly lowered from stretchers into his waiting carts. But as the hours passed, the flow of corpses intensified. Every alley, every tenement, every house that had once been a home now contributed to the tide. Barrow and his assistants labored tirelessly, laying bodies into coffins as swiftly as they could fashion them, the rhythmic thud of hammers echoing through the shop like the tolling of a bell. By mid-morning, the supply of prepared coffins dwindled. The wood, hand-selected oak, maple, and pine, had been stockpiled with care. Yet it was insufficient. The undertaker surveyed the stacks, saw splintered wood, half-cut boards, nails scattered across the floor, and realized that no amount of labor could restore what had been consumed so swiftly. His throat tightened, chest constricted with the weight of the problem, the reality that he had never faced. The dead now outnumbered the living's ability to honor them. Assistants whispered among themselves, pale and trembling. One ventured a suggestion: we could use crates or spare boards from the warehouse. Barrow shook his head sharply. No, nothing less than a proper coffin. Respect demands it. Outside, the fog clung to the streets like a living shroud. The sweetness rose from the alleys, slipping through the cracks in the workshop windows and curling around the bodies inside. Barrow inhaled it, felt it settle into his lungs, warm and insistent, as if mocking the human efforts to contain it. A wagon approached, drawn by a horse whose flanks were slick with sweat. It bore 2 more bodies, their faces pale beneath the blankets, the faint warmth of life recently departed lingering against the folds. Barrow's hands shook as he helped unload them. There was no time for hesitation, no time to mourn, only the work that must be done. He moved to the remaining stack of boards, measuring, marking, hammering, while assistants prepared the dead. The hammer struck repeatedly, each blow echoing with finality. Sweat rolled down his brow. His hands were blistered, raw, yet he continued. The sweetness pressed more insistently, curling into the corners of the workshop, into the spaces between coffin and body, as if it sought to remind him that death would not wait. By late afternoon, the problem became undeniable. A family had arrived from Mulberry Bend, 5 members, all gone within hours of one another. There was no coffin available. Barrow looked around the shop, desperate, heart pounding. Every board had been consumed. Nails had been exhausted. Sawdust littered the floor. The very walls seemed to press inward with the city's burden, the air thick with the invisible presence that had followed him here. He stepped back from the pile, hands on hips, chest heaving. The sweetness swirled around him, a tangible reminder that the city's death had no schedule, no respect for human limits. He realized with bitter clarity that his craft, his pride, his dignity, his careful preparation had been overwhelmed. Barrow turned to his assistants. "We continue," he said quietly, voice tight with exhaustion and fear. "But we must acknowledge the truth. There are more dead than wood, more sorrow than we can measure, and the city will not wait for us to catch up." Outside, the fog rolled past the windows, carrying the city's invisible tide into every alley, every tenement, every street. Inside, The workshop smelled of sawdust, sweat, and the pervasive, unrelenting sweetness. Isaac Barrow, master of coffins, understood that he had been forced to confront a cruel, inescapable fact. The city's death had outstripped the mortal hands meant to contain it. And still, he hammered on, every strike a testament to human effort against the inevitable, every splinter a reminder that even skill and devotion had their limits. The steamship Aurora had long been a familiar sight to the residents of Manhattan's East River docks, a silver-hulled vessel that carried cargo and passengers between the city and distant ports, its engines sighing like a restless giant. On this grey morning, the fog hung low, curling around the pilings and drifting into the vessel's decks, softening the outlines of cranes and warehouses. Yet the air was heavier than usual, thick with the faint, pervasive sweetness that had claimed the city. It clung to every rope, every plank, every handrail. Captain Leonard Drake stood at the helm, hands gripping the polished wheel, eyes scanning the misted horizon. He had received his orders hours before: transport passengers and goods northward, maintain schedule, and do so without unnecessary delay. Yet something in the atmosphere pressed upon him with a subtle, unnerving insistence. The sweetness was there, light at first, then rising, pressing gently into his chest, warming the throat, making each breath feel like an intrusion. On the lower deck, passengers shuffled nervously. Families carrying bundles and small children glanced anxiously at one another, their voices hushed, their eyes wide. Businessmen fidgeted with gloves and letters, noting the pallor of fellow travelers. Women pressed handkerchiefs to their noses, sniffing faintly, uncertain, whispering to one another about strange sensations in the air. In the cargo hold, crates marked from the Lower East Side emitted the same faint perfume. Leadenly, the scent seeped into the deck above, wrapping around ankles and waists, brushing against the lungs of anyone who moved too quickly, too close. Even the crew, seasoned men accustomed to the smells of coal and sea, flinched as they caught the odd, warm sweetness and recoiled. Harrow had instructed the hospital staff to document every observation, every anomaly. Now, as the ship cast off from the dock, it carried not only passengers and freight, but also an invisible, merciless companion. The sweetness was patient, insidious, threading itself into the very fabric of the vessel. A young mother clutching her infant turned to a steward. "Is it just me, or does the air feel strange?" she asked. The steward shrugged, uncertain, but he too had smelled it. Warm, sweet, intrusive. "It's only the fog, ma'am," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. As the Aurora moved slowly into the river, the fog thickened, curling around the hull and funneling through the decks. Passengers began to cough, lightly at first, then with increasing urgency. Some staggered, clutching throats. Others sank into benches, pale and trembling. Captain Drake signaled the engineer to maintain speed, but even the rhythm of the engine could not dispel the invisible weight pressing against every breath. Below deck, a small group of passengers huddled, murmuring prayers. Their whispered fears spread among the crew like sparks across dry tinder. The sweetness rose with them, a constant, almost sentient presence, pressing into every corner, penetrating gloves and coats, threading into the very fabric of the ship. By nightfall, as the Aurora approached Long Island Sound, the first passenger had collapsed completely. A man clutching a satchel slumped against the railing, eyes half closed, his breath shallow, leaving a faint cloud of warmth in the night air. Others followed, stumbling, gasping, fainting, the invisible sweetness rising from each and spreading to those nearby. Captain Drake watched helplessly, heart pounding. He had transported people across the harbor countless times, but never had the very air seem to conspire against him. The sweetness, patient, indiscriminate, merciless, had come aboard, and with it, the invisible hand of death. By the time the vessel docked at the next port, The Aurora had become a carrier not only of goods and travelers, but of sickness itself. Each passenger who disembarked carried the weight of the air, unaware that the warmth clung still to clothing, hair, skin, ready to spread further, to claim more, to follow the course of the ship into new streets, new towns, new lives. The river, once a conduit of commerce, had become a silent river of contagion, and the sweetness, patient and relentless, flowed along it, invisible, unyielding, unstoppable. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow had faced death countless times, yet never in a manner so insidious. Surgeons were accustomed to blood, to the tremor of failing hearts, to the abrupt cessation of life within the sterile sanctity of their operating theaters. But the air that had claimed New York moved differently, unseen, unrelenting, wrapping itself around lungs, brushing against throats, and suffocating hope with a sweetness that felt alive. On this night, Harrow confronted it directly. The patient had been brought from a tenement in Mulberry Bend, carried on a stretcher by two exhausted orderlies whose eyes darted nervously to every shadow. He was a young man, barely 20, who had collapsed mid-step on his way to work. His chest rose and fell in shallow, hesitant waves. His skin bore the faint warmth that had become the hallmark of the plague. Harrow removed his gloves slowly, inhaling sharply as the air clung to him, curling around his face and collar. The sweetness was heavier here than anywhere else he had encountered it, pressing like a hand against his sternum. Every instinct told him to step back, to leave the patient for others. Yet duty, training, and the faint hope that knowledge could still hold sway compelled him forward. He knelt beside the bed. The man's pupils flickered uncertainly. His breath, shallow and rapid, seemed to mingle with the air itself, creating an almost visible haze above his chest. Harrow leaned closer, placing his stethoscope against the skin. The pulse fluttered irregularly, hesitant, as though the heart itself feared the invisible weight pressing upon it. Margaret Hale, steady and silent, handed him instruments without speaking. Even she could feel the sweetness pressing against her lungs, yet she continued to assist, whispering words of reassurance to both patient and doctor alike. Harrow inhaled again. The sweetness thickened, curling up from the sheets, drifting around his ears, threading itself into the room. It was not merely air. It was a presence, patient, insistent, as though challenging him to act. He worked with deliberate precision, performing each motion as if rhythm could counteract the invisible force. Incisions, sutures, the steady flow of antiseptic, all were executed with care. Yet the patient's breath did not deepen. The warmth of life remained shallow, hesitant. Minutes passed. Each second felt elongated, weighed down by the oppressive sweetness. Harrow's hands grew damp. His chest burned with the effort of breathing in an atmosphere that seemed to resist him, pressing upon his very lungs. The instruments felt heavy in his grasp, the air itself thickening around them as though mocking the surgeon's efforts. At last, he paused, forehead pressed to the patient's arm. Margaret glanced up, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the uncharacteristic tremor of his hands. "We cannot fight the air itself," he whispered, almost inaudibly. "Not here, not tonight." Yet he continued, because duty demanded persistence. One hand steadied the young man, the other moved with careful, deliberate intent, guided by skill and instinct. Each action was an act of defiance against a force that could not be seen but was palpably real, pressing with warmth and insistence, enveloping the room in its merciless embrace. Outside the window, the fog pressed against the glass. The city's streets were silent, save for distant groans and the occasional thud of collapsing bodies. Inside, the sweetness lingered, swirling around the surgeon, the nurse, and the patient, a constant reminder that life and death were no longer governed solely by human hands. Harrow worked until the first weak light of dawn crept through the windows. The patient's breath remained shallow. The sweetness pressed still, and the surgeon, exhausted but unyielding, understood fully the new truth of his craft. Here, in New York, the battle was no longer only with flesh and disease. It was with the air itself. Mulberry Bend had always been a neighborhood of whispered lives and muted colors, where tenements pressed tightly against one another, and windows seldom opened more than a crack. Families existed in near-perpetual intimacy, sharing warmth and breath in rooms too small for comfort. On ordinary mornings, curtains would sway lightly with the draft, letting in the sunlight that filtered through soot-laden glass. But in this week of creeping plague, the curtains stayed shut. Mrs. O'Rourke, who had lived on the third floor for more than 20 years, had not opened her windows since the first faint reports of sickness had begun to circulate. Her children, normally boisterous, sat quietly at their table, utensils untouched, bread left to harden in their bowls. A soft sweetness lingered in the room, invisible, insistent, pressing against the walls, seeping into the fabric of their clothing. It pressed into Mrs. O'Rourke's lungs with every breath, a reminder that the threat was no longer abstract, no longer confined to rumor. She pressed a hand to her chest and looked at her children. "Stay here," she whispered. "Do not go near the windows." The curtains remained drawn, as they had for days. Across the alley, in the neighboring tenement, the same precaution had been taken. Thick fabric drawn tight, small gaps sealed with damp cloths, shutters locked. Families huddled together, watching the world through cracks too small to admit the sweetness, hoping that isolation might serve as a shield. Outside, the streets were quiet in an unusual way. No laughter, no shouts, only the occasional thud of someone collapsing in the alley, faint and muffled. The gas lamps flickered in the fog, casting halos over the empty sidewalks. The air between buildings was thick with the scent, faintly warm, carrying a heaviness that made even the most resolute hesitate. At the corner, Mrs. Moretti's house sat like a monument of fear. Laundry hung limp on the lines. Doors were bolted, windows sealed, yet the faint aroma of sweetness drifted over the street, curling like smoke from an invisible fire. The children inside stirred uneasily, coughing lightly, eyes wide with incomprehensible fear. Even the adults, stoic and careful, could not escape the air's reach. The quiet was deceptive. A single cough, a faint moan, a whispered plea could pierce the thick air, sending ripples of panic down the alley. Mothers clutched children. Fathers pressed their faces into collars. And still, the curtains stayed shut. In one apartment, a young boy pressed his face to the fabric, straining to see what lay beyond. He caught glimpses of movement, neighbors hurrying, some collapsing mid-step, others bending over children, frantic. The sweetness wrapped itself around him, warm and unyielding. He pulled back from the window, trembling. The streets beyond seemed to pulse with invisible motion. Every breath, every cough, every step carried the scent further. The alleys, once familiar, had become conduits of dread. Even the most careful households, their curtains drawn tight against the outside, could not fully escape. By evening, the pattern had become unmistakable. The street was lined with tenements, each curtain drawn tight, doors bolted, shutters locked. Families whispered to one another in the low, careful tones of those who had learned fear too young. The sweetness lingered in the alleys, thickening near the walls, pressing into keyholes and under doors, climbing into every crack that had not been sealed. Mrs. O'Rourke rested her hands on her knees, listening to the faint creak of stairs, the soft thud of another body claimed elsewhere. The children sat quietly, watching her face for guidance. She exhaled slowly, feeling the oppressive warmth of the air settle over her like a second skin. The curtains remained shut, and in the dim glow of the gas lamps, the street itself seemed to lean inward, holding its breath, waiting for the plague to pass, though everyone knew it would not. Outside, the sweetness waited. Inside, the The curtains remained shut, and the city, as if in tacit agreement, held its silence. Broadway had been lined with flags and banners in anticipation of the spring parade. Red, white, and blue streamed from every lamppost and balcony, fluttering lightly in the soft morning wind. Children had been promised candies and trinkets. Merchants had polished their windows to catch the light of the brass instruments, eager for crowds and coin alike. Even the city's officers, always meticulous in arranging barricades and maintaining order, had looked forward to the display. Yet by dawn, the streets were empty, the banners hanging limp and lifeless, the anticipated applause swallowed by the silence of fear. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow had arrived early, before the fog fully pressed against the city. He watched from a balcony above the street, the sweetness already thick in the air, faint at first, curling like a tendril seeking purchase on every exposed surface. The fog was a living thing, sliding through alleyways, curling over rooftops, pressing gently but insistently into lungs and throats. Even the officers, their polished boots gleaming in the pale light, seemed hesitant, glancing about as though the invisible force itself might claim them mid-step. Merchants and vendors began to emerge, setting up carts with pretzels and roasted chestnuts. Children pressed close to their mothers, eyes wide, sensing a disturbance they could not name. A horse whinnied in a nearby stable, its breath visible in the chill, as though the animals too understood the peculiarity of the morning air. Harrow descended to street level, walking slowly, carefully, breathing in the thick, sweet-laden air. He passed the first corner, where families normally gathered, and found them huddled silently, faces pale, hands gripping each other, eyes wide. Even the smallest gestures, a hand pressed to a child's cheek, a whispered reassurance, were muted by the suffocating presence that hung over the city. The band, scheduled to open the parade, had arrived in full dress, instruments polished and ready. Yet as the conductor lifted his baton, no sound emerged. Brass gleamed in the fog, strings trembled with invisible tension, but the music refused to begin. The musicians looked at one another, unease spreading across their faces. The sweetness wrapped itself around them, warm and oppressive, pressing against lungs and throats alike. Harrow moved between them, feeling the air cling, seeking purchase, settling over his skin like a second garment. He coughed lightly, a warning to himself, and the musicians flinched. The conductor lowered his baton slowly, eyes flicking toward the corners of the street. "Not today," he whispered, though no one heard. Along the length of the avenue, spectators began to retreat. Mothers gathered children, clinging to them, walking backward toward home, down alleyways, away from the invisible force that pressed against the city. Merchants shuttered windows and doors, stepping inside quickly, glancing nervously over their shoulders. Even the officers at their posts seemed unwilling to move forward, their boots scraping the pavement nervously. By mid-morning, the parade, once a symbol of civic pride and celebration, had ceased to exist. The floats were unmoved, the banners limp, the brass instruments cold. The air itself had asserted dominion. Every corner, every doorway, every lamppost seemed to bend inward, as though the city itself acknowledged that this day would pass without festivity, without music, without applause. Harrow looked up and inhaled the heavy sweetness, feeling it settle in his chest. He understood then that the city had surrendered to the invisible, pervasive presence. The parade would never march. The crowds would never cheer. And the city's heart, usually bright with life, had faltered beneath the soft, relentless weight of the air itself. The sweetness lingered. The banners drooped. And Broadway, silent and empty, waited, holding its breath for the next claim of the invisible plague. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow had walked through the city's hospitals for days without pause, navigating corridors thick with the smell of sickness, of fever, and now of the ever-present sweetness that seemed to bind the air to the very flesh of the living. He had tended to children gasping in classrooms, men collapsing mid-street, women fainting in parlors, and countless more whose homes had become tombs. Yet, it was in the quiet of his office that he finally allowed himself to confront the truth he had resisted. The evening sun filtered weakly through the tall, grimy windows, catching dust motes that hung like tiny specters in the lamplight. The ward beyond was silent for once, the patients either asleep, fading, or carried elsewhere by attendants who themselves were exhausted beyond measure. Harrow sank into his chair, hands gripping the edges, knuckles white. The faint warmth of the sweetness lingered even here, teasing at the edges of his lungs, reminding him that the city was alive in its cruelty. He exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to his forehead. Each heartbeat seemed to echo in the still air. He thought of the families he had failed to save, of the faces pressed pale beneath coarse blankets, of the children who had looked to him for protection, only to find it insufficient. "Margaret," he whispered, and the nurse appeared in the doorway, as silent and steadfast as ever. Her eyes met his, conveying understanding without words. He shook his head. "I have seen enough." Margaret stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Doctor, what do you mean?" Harrow's voice was low, tremulous yet clear. This is no ordinary illness. The speed, the spread, the invisibility, it is beyond human comprehension. The air itself carries it, moves it, claims lives before we can act. We have treated, soothed, documented, but it is futile. Every measure we take is inadequate. Margaret's breath caught. "You mean the city is lost?" Harrow closed his eyes. "I have done everything I can. I have walked corridors, tended patients, recorded observations, sent letters. I have spoken with the board. I have instructed the nurses. I have written to Washington. And yet the tide does not slow. It only rises." He leaned back, staring at the faint glow of the lamps. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting and pooling, as though the air itself were aware of his acknowledgement. "I must admit it now, not to the city, not to the board, not even to myself. Until this moment. We cannot stop it. We cannot slow it. We can only bear witness." Margaret pressed a trembling hand to his shoulder. "Then what do we do?" Harrow opened his eyes. They reflected both exhaustion and a clarity that came with surrender. "We continue. We care for those still living, guide the families, maintain what dignity remains. And we record everything. Because if this ends, and I do not know how or when, someone must remember what happened here, what the city endured, what the air itself delivered." Outside, the sweetness drifted faintly through the open windows, rising from streets, alleys, and tenements. It clung to the folds of curtains, to the edges of the desks, threading into the hospital like a slow, patient spectre. Harrow inhaled it once, and with it came a cold understanding. Human hands, human knowledge, human hope, all were insufficient against what now ruled the city. He rose from his chair, shoulders heavy, and walked to the ward. Patients stirred in their beds, some coughing softly, others shivering beneath the weight of invisible forces. The nurses moved with him, their eyes steady, hands gentle. The city beyond waited in quiet menace, streets empty, alleys silent, gas lamps flickering. Harrow's final admission was no secret to those who had seen, heard, and felt the air. The battle had been lost before it began. All that remained was to bear witness, to care where possible, and to endure as the city surrendered to the patient, unyielding and merciless air. The sweetness lingered. The wards breathed it in, and the doctor, at last, did the same. Winter came slowly to New York that year, creeping down from the north in icy fingers that whispered through alleyways and pressed against tenement windows. The city, long accustomed to the chill of early December, now felt different, heavier, more deliberate, as if the cold had recognized the sweetness that had claimed its streets and decided to act. The air itself stiffened, biting at exposed skin, sharpening the edges of stone and brick, and carrying with it a relief both cruel and fleeting. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow stepped out onto the hospital's steps one morning, his coat buttoned tightly, scarf wrapped high against his throat. The fog was lighter than usual, thinner, yet it still carried the faint, lingering sweetness that had haunted every corner of the city for weeks. He inhaled cautiously, noticing the bite of cold in his lungs, the way it burned slightly as it forced him to exhale in shallow puffs. The winter had not destroyed the sweetness, but it had slowed it, constraining its movement, forcing it to fold and curl where once it had surged unchecked. Inside the hospital, the wards had quieted, if only marginally. Beds were still filled, but fewer stretchers arrived at the side doors. Fewer bodies, fewer collapsed families, fewer children fainting in the narrow corridors of the tenements. Nurses moved with more composure, though Margaret Hale's hands remained raw, her eyes still haunted by the weight of all she had witnessed. She adjusted blankets on a sleeping child and murmured, "It slows. For now." Harrow walked among them, checking pulse, observing the rise and fall of breath, noting the pallor and warmth of skin. The sweetness, ever present, now felt as if it had been pressed into corners and cracks by the advancing cold. It lingered in hallways but lost the immediate force it had carried in the warmer months. He watched a young man from Mulberry Bend breathe more steadily, a small glimmer of color returning to his cheeks. It was not victory, not yet, but it was relief, the first whisper of reprieve. The streets outside bore the same pattern. Children emerged from shuttered windows, cheeks pinked by frost, breath visible in the cold air. Mothers followed cautiously, glancing at the alleys, at the distant silhouettes of neighbors and the occasional officer standing uncertainly at intersections. The sweetness still drifted through the air, faint, subtle, but no longer pressing on the chest with unyielding insistence. It moved more slowly, dissipated before it reached the upper stories of tenements and allowed the people to feel, if only for a moment, that survival was still possible. Even the undertakers noticed the change. Isaac Barrow, whose wood had long been exhausted, stood beside a half-empty street, observing fewer wagons arriving with the dead. The frost had slowed the decomposition, stiffened limbs, and chilled the bodies, buying him a fraction of time to fashion coffins and tend the city's sorrow with what dignity he could. By afternoon, a cautious calm settled over Mulberry Bend and the surrounding neighborhoods. Families ventured slightly further from their doorways. Laundry, long, damp and heavy in the air, swayed in the icy breeze. The gas lamps flickered in weak halos against the deepening shadows of winter. Even the fog seemed less assertive, curling delicately around lampposts rather than pressing into the streets. Harrow stood once more on the steps of Bellevue, surveying the city from above. The winter had not eradicated the sweetness. It had not ended the plague. But it had slowed it, constrained it, given the living a brief margin of breathing space, as precious as it was fragile. He drew a deep breath of cold, sharp air, and for the first time in weeks felt it reach his lungs untainted, free from the insistent warmth that had haunted him. A momentary victory, a pause in the relentless march of the invisible enemy. Yet even as the frost glinted across the rooftops and the river glittered in pale sunlight, Harrow knew the city's respite was tenuous. The sweetness remained, lurking, patient, waiting for the warmth to return, for the air to carry it anew. And the people, though they breathed more easily for now, did so in the knowledge that winter had only delayed the inevitable. The plague had faltered, but it had not been defeated, and the city, wrapped in frost and silence, trembled under the weight of its fragile reprieve. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow sat alone at his desk in the dimly lit office of Bellevue Hospital, the air around him heavy with the lingering sweetness that had haunted the city for weeks. Outside, the fog lay thick across the streets, curling around lampposts and alleyways, muting the sound of the few pedestrians daring to venture into the frozen morning. The wards had quieted, though the patient beds were still occupied, the stretchers still lined the hallways, and the echoes of the past weeks lingered like shadows too stubborn to fade. Before him lay the ledger, a record of lives touched, measured, and all too often claimed. He traced the inked lines, each name a testament, each entry a story, each tally a reminder of the city's failure to defend itself against an enemy no one could see. Mulberry Bend, Hester Street, the Lower East Side, names of children, mothers, fathers, and the elderly, pressed into the pages like whispers of the forgotten. Harrow's pen hovered over a blank page, hesitant. He had tried, in his own way, to maintain order, to understand the spread, to record methodically, but the ledger had grown too long, too heavy, too inadequate to capture the enormity of what had transpired. Every entry felt incomplete, every note insufficient. Even the warmth of the sweetness seemed to press against the paper, as if mocking his attempts at comprehension. He turned back to a previous page. A family of 5, all lost in a single night, their deaths recorded in neat columns. Yet the ink could not convey the fear in their eyes, the quiet despair of a child gasping in his mother's arms, the helplessness of a father pressed against the door of a room that had become a tomb. Harrow leaned back, hands pressed to his temples, feeling the weight of every lost life as though it pressed upon his skull. Margaret Hale entered silently, her expression grave. "Doctor," she said softly, "there are more arriving." Harrow nodded without looking up. "I know," he murmured, "but the ledger, it can only hold so much." She glanced at the pages, at the neat rows of names and tallies. "They deserve more than numbers," she said, voice trembling. "They deserve to be remembered." He drew a deep, shuddering breath. "And they will be, Margaret. In these pages, in every observation, every note, every whispered account, we bear witness." The sweetness, now faint but omnipresent, swirled around them. Harrow could feel it threading through the edges of the ledger, through the ink, as though it sought to claim even the act of recording for itself. He closed the book slowly, pressing a hand over it, trying to hold the memory of the names against the tide of forgetting. Outside, the city moved quietly. Carriages rattled over frozen streets. Gas lamps cast soft, trembling light. Residents, cautious and wary, stepped carefully through the fog, aware only faintly of the scale of loss around them. To them, these deaths were numbers, statistics, the invisible tally of an invisible enemy. To Harrow, each line in the ledger was a pulse, a whisper, a life. He opened a fresh page and began again. Names, dates, places, every detail he could recall. Even the tiniest observation mattered. The warmth of skin, the hesitation in a breath, the faint aroma of the sweetness that clung to each. He wrote with care, though his hand shook, though his vision blurred, though exhaustion pressed into every muscle. By nightfall, the ledger was fuller. The city outside remained indifferent, but inside, the act of recording became a quiet defiance. Harrow understood that the ledger of the forgotten was more than paper and ink. It was memory, testimony, resistance against erasure. And as the gas lamps flickered, casting trembling shadows across the office, he whispered the names silently, one by one, ensuring that the city's dead would not vanish entirely. Even if the living could not see them, the sweetness lingered, the ledger grew, and the forgotten, finally, were remembered. By the time the winter sun had fully risen over the slate roofs of Manhattan, the city had grown eerily quiet. Streets once thrumming with commerce and laughter now lay abandoned, save for the occasional figure moving with hesitation, eyes darting to alleys and windows as if the shadows themselves bore witness to what had transpired. The sweetness, faint now, residual, almost respectful in its restraint, drifted lightly over the streets. a soft ghost of the pervasive force that had claimed so much life. Dr. Nathaniel Harrow walked through the wards of Bellevue one final time, pausing at each bed, each mattress, each stretcher that still held those who had survived. Nurses moved silently around him, exhausted yet vigilant, their faces pale with the knowledge of how many had fallen. The ward was quieter than it had been for weeks. The tide of suffering had slowed, constrained by frost and distance, yet the memory of what had passed pressed against every wall, every floorboard, every patient's chest. Outside, the city resumed a semblance of routine, though faintly, as if its movements were tentative, measured, respectful. Shopkeepers reopened their stores. Children ventured into alleys under careful watch. Carriages rolled down streets that had once echoed with sirens and cries. Yet the city moved with an unspoken agreement: to ignore, to suppress, to forget. The casualties, the collapsed tenements, the families whose names were recorded only in Harrow's meticulous ledger, these were to remain invisible, buried beneath the polished surfaces of commerce and civility. Harrow paused at a window overlooking Mulberry Bend. The alleys were silent, save for the distant shuffle of a few brave pedestrians. He thought of the tenements, now shuttered and empty, of the curtains that had remained drawn, of the children who had stared through small cracks, breathing air they could not escape. He had witnessed the collapse of lives, the fall of families, the silent acquiescence of a city that chose to protect itself through willful ignorance. He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, feeling the faint sweetness linger in the hospital air, brushing against his lungs. For weeks, the invisible force had stalked the city, moving silently through neighborhoods, through alleys, through the very air. And now, the city had decided not to acknowledge it fully, to move forward while leaving the memory of loss to the few who had witnessed it firsthand. In his office, Harrow opened the ledger one last time, tracing the inked lines with fingers that trembled slightly. Each name, each entry, a testament to what had been endured. Yet he knew that when the pages were set aside, when the doors of Bellevue closed for the evening, the city itself would not remember. There would be no monuments erected, no public acknowledgement, no streets named for the children who had vanished, or the families erased. Only the faint smell of sweetness, lingering like a secret, would remain. He closed the ledger and placed it carefully in a drawer. The ward was quiet, the nurses watching, patients breathing shallowly but steadily. Outside, the gas lamps flickered, and the city continued its cautious rhythm, pretending, as it always did, that nothing had changed. Harrow understood, finally, that memory was a burden New York would not bear. It preferred illusion to truth, convenience to acknowledgement. The sweetness, patient and pervasive, had left its mark, but the city would not record it. It had survived, yes, but it had chosen a fragile, incomplete survival, one in which the air remembered, the walls remembered, the ledger remembered, but the city itself did not. He stepped back from the window, inhaled once more of the faintly warm air, and whispered softly, a quiet testament to all that had been lost. The city survived, the city forgot, and the plague, patient and unyielding, waited quietly, for it knew that memory alone could not claim it.